can we go into 2017 with positive feelings when like this happens? Like, how do you deal with that?
We all grow up with aspirations, but most kids chop and change their goals throughout childhood and end up in a field that they never expected. If that wasn't the case, there'd be a lot more pirate ninjas and karate princesses in the world. Some of us aren't sure what to do with our lives until we talk through our options with a careers advisor. Others are pushed by a natural drive within them that gives them a clear-cut goal in their heads, with a path already carved out for them, as though it is their destiny set in stone. And that's how it was for Rachel Longridge. Rachel grew up with her younger brother Michael in their Sherbrooke home with mother Christine and father Erin. It was a loving family unit, and the siblings got along well. Rachel had always been inherently caring, thinking of others and lending a helping hand. These qualities, along with her infectious personality, made her quick to make friends and form strong bonds. She and her childhood best friend Marley were thick as thieves. The pair had been born just a week apart from one another in May of 1995, and they grew up celebrating joint birthday parties together. Rachel lived in Sherbrooke, and Marley lived in Dovercourt. The two of them would cheekily cut through neighbours' yards to see one another, even though they'd been told to walk around the trail that divided the two. They were truly inseparable. Marley would later share that their sleepovers had always resulted in bellyaches from so much laughter on her social media. Rachel's soccer coach, Sandra Hansen, said she liked to goof around a lot and she was a good player. And by all accounts, Rachel was kind, caring, and incredibly popular. And this makes what happened next all the more difficult to digest. Rachel already knew that she wanted to become a nurse, but after her father Erin was diagnosed with cancer and the family spent time in and out of the hospital, she just knew that she had to pursue it. Rachel applied to the University of Alberta for nursing, and she started there after finishing high school. It was there that she met new friends Danielle Burke and Dakota Burgum, and they all hit it off instantly and became a real threesome. Rachel's struggles with her dad having cancer cemented her decision and really fueled her. She was driven to achieve her goals despite her home life becoming tough. During the many hours she spent training at Edmonton Clinic Health Academy, she really did make a huge impact on many lives. Rachel was clearly the type of person who could handle pretty much anything. Becoming a nurse is not easy, but that didn't matter because this dream was important. This was made evident by the fact that the tenacious nursing student attended her course the day after her father sadly lost his battle on December the 1st, a true show of strength and dedication. Rachel's hard work and tenacity in the face of such sad circumstances did pay off. On December the 8th, she graduated from her nursing program and was anxiously waiting to hear back about working in the intensive care unit of the Mazankowski Alberta Heart Institute. The formidable trio of study buddies celebrated finals with a trip up to Jasper immediately after, and even Marley, Rachel's childhood best friend, joined them for the fun. The four of them headed up the mountains to unwind after all of their hard work. It was on this journey to Jasper that Rachel finally received the news that she was waiting for. Her offer was confirmed and she was due to start work on January the 3rd. This put everyone into pure celebration mode. Her friends were thrilled for her, and it also meant that she and Dakota would now be working in the same building as one another. Rachel couldn't have been happier. All of her hard work had been worth it, and her dreams were now coming to fruition. After a few drinks and dinner, the girls ventured into the hotel hot tub in spite of the wind chill warnings and the late time of year. There they sat for hours enjoying themselves so much that they didn't even mind the chilling air until, that is, hotel staff finally shut them down, with their hair frozen stiff from frost. This truly was a night that the best friends would remember forever, but it was even more special than they knew at the time. In late December, the season of goodwill was in full swing, with everyone celebrating the festivities that come with the run-up to the new year. The year ahead looked to be promising, and with Rachel's dreams about to become a reality, There really was plenty to celebrate. The Longridge family planned a small party, one which Marley, among others, was planning to go to celebrate Christmas Eve with them. None of them could have imagined that they would instead be mourning a severe loss. The day before the family's planned celebrations, 18-year-old Michael Longridge, Rachel's younger brother, came home to a scene he was unprepared for. Not that anyone could ever be prepared for what he walked in on when he entered the Sherbrooke bungalow in Edmonton that he had always called home. Michael returned home that day on December the 23rd, 2018, to find his sister being terribly attacked. Like any other with a strong sibling bond, he rushed straight towards danger. He wanted to help his sister without a second thought about his own safety. A brave act considering the attacker was hysterically wielding a meat cleaver and was attempting to remove his sister's head from her body. Michael rushed towards them and fought hard to hold the attacker's arms back, trying to prevent them from doing any further harm. His reactions were quick, adrenaline flooding his body, only he had arrived a few moments too late. With such severe injuries sustained, Rachel's time on this earth was ended before authorities arrived. Having witnessed the events firsthand, there was no doubt as to who was responsible. The terrifying and grisly scene that Michael had walked in on was likely made 1,000 times worse because the person wielding the cleaver was Christine, Rachel and Michael's own mother. The woman who had brought Rachel into the world had now taken her out of it, and in one of the most brutal ways possible. Police took the 50-year-old woman away in handcuffs after they were called with reports of an assault at around 4:30 p.m. Christine was taken into custody facing second-degree murder and possession of a weapon, but a psychiatric examination was immediately requested and an inquiry would soon follow. Christine had in fact been battling with her mental health for years. Many murderers are taken into custody displaying signs that they may be psychotic. Many require psychiatric assessments, and some even use mental illness as an excuse. And indeed, many offenders are not well, especially those whose crimes are of a particularly horrific nature. However, faking it evidently wasn't the case with Christine. The mother was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder in the 90s, following a delirium she experienced shortly after the birth of her son. People suffering from schizoaffective disorders can hallucinate quite heavily, which when combined with heavy mood swings can be a recipe for disaster. I will say that people with schizoaffective disorders are more likely to be victims than perpetrators. I feel it's important to make that known. It seems that with her disorder, Michael's birth kick-started her first real psychotic episode, an episode in which she suffered from some grandiose delusions. She believed her beautiful son to be the Messiah and was hospitalized on more than one occasion. Although the delusions experience can be pretty strong, schizoaffective disorders can normally be managed with medication, and in most cases, people can live a relatively normal life. And Christine's illness had been well managed, that is, up until her husband's death the year before. Husband Erin had in fact played a big role in his wife's mental health care, not to mention the fact that the death of a loved one would move almost anyone into the reach of depression's grip. For Christine, with her disorder, it had certainly become a notable catalyst, and she slid firmly into its grasp. Those in her life would share with police investigators that Christine's mental health had been declining in recent weeks. The mother had never been violent in any way, shape or form. The aggression that drove her while she took such extreme actions, and their tragic results, came as a shock to everyone around the family. Many defended Christine, stating she was a loving mother, saying everything about this situation was purely tragic. A vigil was organised on campus for the late graduate, with over 250 people showing up to remember Rachel. Whilst there, they shared their fondest memories.
Anytime that I ever felt down, Rachel was there to be like, no, you can do it. We studied together, we cried together, we laughed together. We did so many things together and we had so many plans, and it's just heartbreaking to think that me and Dakota and my sister have to go on without her, and because she was supposed to be there, she was supposed to be our person for the rest of our lives.
Among the crowd was a mix of friends, students, teachers, patients, and the families of those that she had treated. Everyone in attendance had something to say about how charismatic and caring the young woman truly was. Her closest friends made a point to defend the relationship between Rachel and Christine, making it clear that the event was simply a tragic and unpredictable one. The focus of the vigil was very much on keeping things positive and supporting Michael, whose mother was now in custody and whose sister had passed. Michael didn't attend the vigil, but Marley shared the following with everyone present. The main thing he wanted for tonight was to let everybody know that his mom loves him and loves Rachel, and wanted everyone to know this is nothing but a mental health issue. Danielle Burke would share that Christine's illness was understood by Rachel's closest friends, describing it as understood and accepted. She also shared how Rachel had taken on her mother's care after caring for her father in his final days. She had now done the same for her mother in her own final days. Michael has repeatedly made it clear that the blame does not sit at the door of his mother. However, we can look at mental health care as a whole. Many of those closest to the case would hold the lack of mental health care support that Christine received, despite her history of psychotic breaks, as the real guilty party in the catastrophe. Christine's decline was evident in medical records, as the mother wasn't keeping up to date with her psychiatric appointments. She was, in fact, meant to have seen her psychologist on the 21st, just 2 days before she ended her daughter's time on this earth. Mother Christine's court appearance came on January the 10th, 2016, 1 week after her daughter should have started her first proper hospital job. There, the failures of the system were brought to light. Police had been called on October the 30th that year after neighbours found Christine curled up on her deck, screaming in a paranoid state. Had police called a mental health crisis team, a tragedy may have been prevented. It was then heard that Christine's sister drove her to the local ER later that very same night, but the hospital refused admission. Christine was then found running around outside in the snow without shoes a few days later. She was convinced her house was going to explode. On November the 7th, she was finally hospitalized following an attempt on herself, but she was only kept in for a week. And despite the seriousness of her mental decline, her medications were changed and she was only prescribed half her usual lithium dosage. Perhaps something could have been done. We will truly never know. Her messiah delusion then crept back into the scenario. This was just days before the tragic event. She became convinced that Rachel had to die to save Michael, something she repeatedly told those around her. Judge Wayne Renke was choked up throughout sentencing. Christine was charged with second-degree murder, but she was not found criminally responsible and was instead sent to a secure psychiatric hospital. Judge Renke said there was zero doubt that the woman knew what she was doing and that she intended to do it, but also ruled that delirium had taken over. When Christine attacked her daughter, she believed that she had the moral authority to kill. A GoFundMe page was set up by cousins to cover the funeral costs and to make sure that Michael had support. The case was viewed as an indictment of Alberta's mental health system, and subsequently, allegedly, steps were taken to improve it.
Penny betrayed Scott. He knows that he was used, played, betrayed, had his emotions toyed with, and then, at the end of the summer, when she was finished having her fun with him, she just tossed him aside like garbage. How cool and superior will you look, when I blow your brains out into the ground?
Penny was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, USA, to Chinese parents Qing Lung and Yun Hua Chang. At the time, her mathematics professor father was studying at Carnegie Mellon when they decided to return back to China, taking Penny with them to go and live with relatives while she was still little. However, the family didn't stay there for too long, and they moved back to the US when Penny turned 5. And there she grew up with her 3 siblings in an affluent neighborhood known as Shaker Heights in Ohio. The neighborhood was just outside of Cleveland. Penny's parents described her as happy and a very neat child, someone who loved to play chess, but who became very Americanized over time. But as she got older, this drove somewhat of a divide between Penny and her parents. Her mother and father were very conservative, and they stuck with their traditional Chinese roots. It seemed like it was hard for them to see their daughter becoming more Americanized. This was a stark contrast to how they lived their lives. Penny was a known chatterbox, and she had a lot of friends. She was into things that were quite typical of teenagers at the turn of the century. She loved Japanese animations. She wrote poetry. She was a big fan of Leonardo DiCaprio, as well as the Spice Girls. She and her older sister Joanne would often go shopping for clothes together, and Penny would often raid her sister's wardrobe as she got older. Penny's older brother Sean's closest friend was a man named Scott Struthers. Scott spent a lot of time with the family, with everyone describing Scott as having practically grown up in the Chang household on Normandy Road. Scott went on to graduate from high school with Sean, and he earned a scholarship at Ohio State, which was good. However, he eventually began to fail at his studies, and then he dropped out, which was bad. Once he returned in 1997, he went on to share a dorm room with Sean at college, and the pair spent so much time together that it meant that Penny and him would start to become closer. Penny had known him for at least a decade, and she considered him as much of a friend of her own as he was to her older brother. And in fact, all 4 siblings seemed to have the same feelings. But as is surprisingly common when moving in with a friend, Sean and Scott would eventually fall out. Living together full time, they annoyed one another, and soon neither were on speaking terms. Scott's life seemed to be taking a kind of downward trajectory. In 1998, he took a job at the Beechwood light bulb factory, where he worked alongside Penny when she was just 14 years old. The owner had been a family friend who gave her the job there, so even though her brother had distanced himself from Scott, Penny still saw him all the time. Scott would regularly walk Penny home like a brother or a gentleman, despite the round trip taking him 40 minutes out of his way. The pair would often stop off at a Wendy's along the way to eat after work, and occasionally would hang out and catch a movie before she went home. Unbeknownst to pretty much everyone else, Scott had been secretly admiring Penny from afar for quite some time, and at around the age of 14, the two began a summer romance of sorts. That is, despite the fact that Scott was 21 years old at the time. Older sister Joanne reports the relationship between the two as actually having been quite innocent, mostly flirting, some holding of hands and a little bit of kissing. But she insists that Penny never considered it to be much of anything, just an adolescent fling. However, in retrospect, obviously we can see that it was very weird, and I should imagine it was also illegal. That summer, she and Scott spent most of it together in and out of the Chang residence. They were hanging out more and more, and no one thought much of it, as he had always been a family friend. But Scott's feelings and emotions seemed to be growing out of control. Eventually, as the summer wound down, Penny spent less and less time hanging out with Scott. Their movie nights ended and she appeared a little more distant. It was around this time that Scott, who had never had a relationship with anyone else previously, asked her to make things official and to be his girlfriend, and Penny refused. Scott knew that once autumn came around and Penny went off to high school, they would start seeing each other far less, and that now his window of opportunity was narrowing. He had strong feelings for the younger sister of his former friend, but now he didn't seem to have an outlet for them. He honestly didn't seem emotionally equipped, even though he was in his 20s. Scott asked to walk Penny home one evening, to which she proposed a rain check. Instead, she reassured him that he could walk her home the following day. Only when that day came, Penny was nowhere to be seen. Instead, she quit her job prematurely and without warning, something which caught Scott off guard. This would become a catalyst for Scott, and he would soon start relentlessly calling, texting, and emailing Penny. In his journal entry surrounding the girl's departure from the light bulb factory, he shares that the two had had another conversation in which Penny told him she was busy and that she would call him sometime, but a fortnight would soon pass, during which Scott heard nothing from his crush. His journal reflects his worries at the time. He feared that once she began at OSU, he would be forgotten. He said he had been left hanging and felt abandoned. Scott's journal entries show that his obsession with Penny became all the more intense as the girl grew more distant from him. His thoughts and feelings that he scribbled down began to flip-flop between holding Penny on some sort of pedestal as a perfect object of desire and viewing her as a manipulative and negative force in his life. And these were obviously a stark contrast to the entries that described their flirtatious summer together, where Penny clearly meant the world to him. Even though Scott was being pretty harassive, Penny hadn't felt stalked because she saw herself to be in no real danger from Scott. After all, he was pretty much like part of the family, so doing anything too bad seemed kind of unrealistic. Scott, though, wasn't ready to give up. He sent a disturbing series of emails. They got more and more deranged, and he began speaking about the two of them in third person, with Scott now objectifying himself as well as Penny. Here are two deranged emails that he sent. Penny betrayed Scott. He knows that he was used, played, betrayed, violated, had his emotions toyed with. And then, at the end of the summer, when she was finished having her fun with him, she just tossed him aside like garbage. That callous, heartless bitch. Does she enjoy casually ruining Scott's life? No. Scott is beginning to think that he didn't overreact whatsoever. Still no apology or explanation. No sympathy or remorse for the massive amounts of suffering that she caused. He also sent the following disturbing message. Scott would like to rip off her lips and put them in a blender and slice them up. Better yet, Scott would like to take her lips while they were still attached to her face and shred them in a blender. It was around this time that other areas of Scott's life began to fall apart. He had a bad argument with his grandmother, and this meant he had to move into a rental unit with his father, and it seems like this is where his thoughts really began to fester. Scott harassed the family from afar. One night they received 100 phone calls from him, forcing them to disconnect the phone, and things only continued to escalate from there. The scorned man now turned to vandalism and arson. He put fiberglass resin in the gas tank of her parents' car and quite insanely tried to burn down their garage. He took out some of the house's windows with a slingshot, and he even began following Penny as she went about her day. There is no doubt Scott had become a dangerous stalker, from someone that was treated like family to someone that was behaving like a stranger. The police were notified of what was going on and they took Scott in for questioning. And they did actually charge him with telephone harassment and misdemeanor arson. But before he was sentenced, Scott voluntarily admitted himself to the Cleveland Clinic for observation. So Scott either knew that he was mentally unwell, or he was just trying to manipulate the system. The clinic kept him for a total of 5 weeks, releasing him on Thanksgiving 1998. It was at the Cleveland Clinic that he was encouraged to journal, and it is these journals that give us a horrifying glimpse into his erratic thoughts and the depraved depths of his obsessions. In his writing, he described how he saw Penny as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. He seemed like an immature teenager in love, rather than the 21-year-old that he actually was. He was giddy and desperate to be in their company, just longing for the slightest bit of attention from this child. In reflecting on the vandalism, he saw his destructive actions as a way to make Penny take him seriously. He also reflected that his actions were a way to remain important in her life, even if it was obviously in a very negative way. Scott Struthers felt neglected by the girl he had poured so much attention into, and who then disappeared from his life without a goodbye. His disdain for the way she treated him is divulged in the following journal excerpt. "What I did to her house was in a way trying to teach her a lesson. I couldn't stand the thought of her going through life, doing to other guys what she did with me." Struthers' ramblings concerned those working with him at the clinic. He exhibited many red flag behaviours, making him a significant risk of violence. It would later be revealed that the clinic's doctor, Kathy Quinn, noted that Scott had a history of violence, a lack of empathy, and severe anger issues. It was clear he was holding a grudge he was unable to get over, and his sense of rejection and humiliation had begun to show many signs of homicidal ideation. He also shared the desire to obtain a weapon, something which he actually took action on. He reached out to a contact to get his hands on a firearm on the morning of his eventual arrest. Scott's initial diagnosis was noted as delusional disorder, impulse control disorder, along with personality disorder not otherwise specified. During his 5 weeks at the clinic, he seemed to be determined to be a danger to others. He was treated on an inpatient basis and underwent testing and counselling and filled a 60-page journal. Yet, even with his stalking, arson, harassment, the fact Penny was a minor, and everything he wrote and said, he was released from this intense level of care, with doctors determining that he was now no longer a threat. And for 3 months, all was quiet on the Scott and Penny front, during which time he continued regular counselling with a private therapist. Then, almost 4 months after his release, Scott Struthers just had to see Penny Chang one last time. On the morning of March 16, 1999, Penny set off for school, and there on the corner of the Lee Road and Van Aken Boulevard intersection, situated in the centre of Shaker Heights, Scott Struthers approached the now 15-year-old from behind. He raised his firearm, aimed at the back of her head, and he pulled the trigger 4 times, each one a hit. Penny was rushed to the emergency room, but she was beyond saving. Her family recalled the terrible moment of receiving the phone call, hearing of Penny's death. It was hard to believe that Scott, who had grown up with all of the Chang children, could do anything like this. Sean was left shocked and devastated that his once best friend could kill his little sister. Scott was apprehended and charged with murder. It was then a long 6-month wait before the trial would eventually begin. A small grace for the Chang family was that as the trial began, Scott pleaded guilty for the shooting. The case was pretty open and shut, but it was during the trial that the family caught wind of his deeply disturbing journal entries, the ones written at the clinic, where Scott should have been getting help. His final entry from the stay at the clinic read, "How cool and superior will you look, bitch, when I blow your f***ing brains out into the ground." It was then that the Chang family attempted to sue the clinic with a wrongful death case of $20 million. This case was complex and difficult to navigate because of confidentiality. The clinic couldn't release every detail of the man's treatment, but during the trial that followed, it was revealed that 2 days before his Thanksgiving release, nobody present at a meeting with Scott felt comfortable around him. Scott also believed that he had a sixth sense, one which told him that Penny Chang was, and I quote, deeply in love with him, even though she didn't act like it. The defense argued that the events that unfolded was something that no one could have predicted. Therapists can sometimes predict potential short-term violence, ranging from 24 to 72 hours after an evaluation, but Scott hadn't been violent for over 3 months. The prosecution, however, was convinced that something more could have been done, especially given that his desire to kill Penny was no secret in his writings. The clinic's lawyers astoundingly pointed the blame at Penny's own family. They claimed that things may have turned out differently if they had taken the man's stalking and threats more seriously. Crazy. Defense lawyers can be the absolute worst. The case was complicated and lasted for over a week, but it was finally ruled that the clinic was not at fault for releasing Scott Struthers on Thursday the 10th of October 2002. Scott's deceptive nature allowed him to easily manipulate a system that was full of cracks. But sadly, regardless of who is to blame, the outcome of this case cannot be changed. Scott Struthers was sentenced to 23 years to life. Madison Middleton was born on the 5th of October 2006 in Mountain View, California, United States. The kind and funny girl was born to Michael Middleton and Laura Jordan. She was also adored and loved by Dan Middleton, her grandfather. Madison, or Maddie as she was normally known, stood out with her cheeky smile, freckled face, and was known as a happy child, free and full of life. She moved to Santa Cruz with her parents, a move that seemed to be best for the family, but instead it would see them sharing an apartment complex with a real-life monster. Santa Cruz is a beautiful city on the central California coast. It has a long wharf, eateries and restaurants, and shops that stretch into the Monterey Bay. With a population of around 65,000, it has a picturesque beach, along with a boardwalk and vintage fair rides. It's somewhere that tourists love, as well as being a haven for its regular inhabitants. Nothing about Santa Cruz could have prepared anyone for the tragic, ugly incident that happened in 2015. Madison left her home in the apartment building on the 25th of July 2015. Unknowingly to her mother, she hadn't just wandered off. Instead, she had been lured away, but nobody knew where. Mother Laura Jordan quickly realized that Maddie wasn't where she should be. Her heart dropped in her chest. She immediately reported her daughter missing. Police scrambled to locate her alive and well, but everything was not as it seemed. Remember, Maddie hadn't just run away from home. Instead, she had been asked to attend a birthday party at the Tannery Arts Center, although she wasn't immediately keen on the idea. After all, stranger danger had been drilled into her to convince her that it would be worth sneaking away from her home. The person had told her that there would be lots of ice cream at a birthday party, an offer that Maddie just couldn't resist. But who was the male that had convinced her to leave the safety of her home? After 5 p.m, Maddie was seen riding a micro-scooter with the male. He looked quite young, probably a teenager, an age gap that if you watch enough of these videos, should make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. The male had dark hair and was otherwise unremarkable. Witnesses, along with CCTV, saw Maddie with her long hair pulled to the side in a braid, and she seemed to be enjoying the ride. The male was soon identified as Adrian Gonzalez. To an outsider, he seemed like a normal kid, and there was hardly any trace of a troubled history. So perhaps he was responsible for Maddie leaving her home, but then she ran off and became lost, or was taken by someone else.
What can you tell us about what she was doing out here?
She was riding her brand new scooter. It's a white Razor. She had a black helmet on, she was wearing a purple dress, and she was just happy as could be riding around.
Now, did you check with friends to see if she was with them?
Absolutely. We've searched the entire tannery, door to door. Officers have gone door to door, every loft. We've looked at cameras. We've had search parties all night long.
Is there anyone else? Is there another friend, an adult friend she might have befriended or anything like that?
Not that I can think of at all.
Has she ever done anything?
Nothing. Never. She's never left tannery property. She knows where she's can and cannot be here. She was, in the courtyard where she was supposed to be. She came over here, and that was the last we saw of her on surveillance.
So where do you go? I mean, I just got to ask, how difficult is it knowing that you can't really do anything? I mean, you're doing what you can, but...
I already fell apart. Now I'm just in survival mode. I can't explain how difficult this is. Nobody should have to go through this.
The Tannery Arts Center where it was said there would be a birthday party, and the ice cream is where Gonzalez worked as a counselor, and there he was generally respected among his peers. So what did happen to Maddie? So far this doesn't fully add up. Gonzalez was within eyeshot of the policeman when they started looking for Maddie Middleton after the alert went out. The 15-year-old who had an obsession with yo-yos and writing dark notes was seen consistently around the area of the search. He didn't seem to have any concern that he himself would be suspected, let alone ever be arrested. In fact, he even injected himself into the investigation. He went up to an officer and asked them what they were looking for, or if they had found what they needed to see. It was commonplace to see darker pictures and commentary on his Instagram profile, but he was 15, so perhaps that's not that unusual. However, around the time that Maddie went missing, he would share some ominous posts. He shared a post of the song Mad World by Gary Jules. The song that featured on a 2001 film Donnie Darko was not the cheeriest of songs, and perhaps the film itself was significant. After all, the title character did have dreams surrounding death, and underneath the video were lyrics from the song. They read, "The dreams in which I'm dying are the best I've ever had." Gonzalez's obsession with death did seem to run deeper than people otherwise thought, and indeed this post could be seen as both ominous and troubling. 2 days after this post, and 2 days after Maddie was reported missing, her body was sadly discovered. She had been stuffed into a trash bag and discarded as rubbish. The location was in the very same building that she was reported missing from. Adrian Jerry Gonzalez, or AJ as he was otherwise known, was subsequently arrested, much to the shock of local residents. At first, those who knew him dismissed the case as being an intentional murder, saying that it might have been a game that went awfully wrong, but that he wouldn't have done it on purpose. Whatever happened must have happened close to home. Maddie can't have made it very far. We heard that it was possibly a horrible accident, that something went all wrong. Whoever it was young enough to be frightened and tried to hide the scene. The words of local resident Jeannie Cartibiano in a phone interview with the Washington Post. However, details soon surfaced that pointed towards Gonzalez having murderous intent and having planned the kidnap and eventual murder of Maddie. She stood at just 4 feet tall and weighed just 48 pounds. Following the investigation and arrest, Santa Cruz District Attorney Jeff Russell announced that he was charging Gonzalez as an adult for murder, for kidnapping, and for sexual assault. According to a criminal complaint, Maddie was never taken to the tannery for ice cream. She was at an age where she could have easily trusted anyone, and there was really no reason for her to not believe Gonzalez's intentions were pure. Instead though, she was taken to his apartment, and there he not only tied her up, but took her by surprise, knocking her unconscious to ensure that she didn't cry for help. To help keep her quiet, Gonzalez also used duct tape on her mouth to hold it closed. He then violated her in a prolonged attack. After attempting to manually throttle her, he instead used a sharp implement and dragged it across her neck. Maddie's time on this earth, sadly, came to an end. To show that he was conscious of what he had done and that he wanted to preserve himself, he stuffed her into a waste bag and carried the body down into the communal waste room. After that, without a care in the world, AJ Gonzalez took a picture of himself and posted it to Instagram. Neighbors were surprised and shocked to discover that AJ could be capable of any of this. He had a great reputation at the tannery and was really loved by the people there. A local resident said, "He was our poster child." A neighbor added, "He's just a normal kid who hangs out on the levee with other kids and plays with his yo-yo all day long. He doesn't strike a chord as being a killer." Upon news of the accusations aimed at Gonzalez, his Instagram account was flooded with people attacking him because of his alleged actions. His own posts seemed to be incriminating himself. The account was soon deactivated. Hardly had he disposed of the girl's body than Maddie's mother called the police on Sunday evening. This was revealed as he was caught on camera by a surveillance video. The video of him dumping the body was caught on CCTV, and he even visited the spot twice after officers arrived in search of the girl. He repeatedly asked the police if they were making any progress. Aside from that, Gonzalez kept pestering Sotoro Garcia, another resident, with questions about the search for Maddie's body. Whatever he wanted to achieve was unclear, perhaps some form of gratification, but his lack of genuine emotion just made him a valid suspect in the case. Neighbor Garcia would later worry that Gonzalez kept pestering him and that he seemed to be the only one doing so. There was only one reason for that: he was probably involved. Eventually, when Maddie's body was discovered, AJ Gonzalez was standing close by, watching it all unfold. Although at the time he was charged as an adult, his age meant he would be exempt from the death penalty according to authorities.
Aaron, they started things off by singing happy birthday to Maddie, and family and friends who were there say that they really did feel her presence at that celebration in the park today.
I know that my daughter Madison is looking out for me, and she's here today with everybody celebrating.
The people who knew and loved Madison Middleton got together to celebrate her life.
It's been a really scary summer, so we want to give them some fun.
There was face painting, cuddly animals, and the bounce houses. Lots of fun, but the goal here was a kind of collective healing, getting through an incredibly difficult time together, and the kids responded.
Having fun.
And Maddie's personality was in every detail, from the purple cupcakes, one of her favorite desserts, to this painting, sporting her trademark saying, "You better be qualified."
It was just showing her sassiness and her personality and her humor.
In November of 2017, when the trial began, AJ Gonzalez first pleaded not guilty. There were also some controversies about prosecuting him as an adult, because he was only 15 when he committed the crime. By now, 2 years had passed since that fateful Sunday in July of 2015. In a 2016 California Proposition 57, the law was passed that the judge decides if the accused can be prosecuted as an adult, and in this case, it meant that he cannot be sentenced to death, nor given the sentence that an adult would be handed. Gonzalez was sentenced to juvenile prison, but was moved to an adult facility when he turned 25 in 2024. He must also register as an offender, according to the ruling of Santa Cruz County Superior Judge John Salazar. He added that the Senate Bill 1391 prohibits juveniles from being prosecuted as adults, so this limits the penalties that could be imposed on the offender. There is no way for anyone to understand the profound and absolute pain and grief a family experiences under these circumstances, Judge Salazar said. Before the sentencing on April 15th, Gonzalez offered an apology of sorts to Maddie's family. In this apology, he said that he hopes one day to earn their forgiveness. These are some of his words. "I understand there is very little I can say after all the pain and suffering I've caused, and my goal is to work on my issues so no one else has to experience what you have endured. That does not make anything easier, it just allows me peace. The alternative could be to hold on to the darkness, but this would only consume my soul. I refuse to poison my soul and existence. Forgiveness is the only path, and I believe that Madison would agree." The Middleton family was not convinced. They believed that Gonzalez was simply looking for leniency and that his appeal should not sway the court in their decision and in their bid to uphold justice. People who are following the case disapprove of the judgment which sought to free Gonzalez when he turns 25, as they recognize that there are loopholes in such laws. A Reddit user named SportsJunkie831 said that he doesn't believe that there is any rehabilitation for anyone who commits crimes of this nature. Subsequent comments from other users iterated that it was premeditated and that such a person should not be allowed in society any longer. The court of public opinion is, thankfully, almost always on the side of victims in these cases. The Middletons were of the same opinion that rehabilitation would not work for Gonzalez. and that he should not be allowed to commit such a heinous crime again. Laura Jordan, Maddie's mother, is unsettled about the proceedings. This is a ridiculous law. All the gangs are going to have 14 and 15-year-olds killing people, she said. The proceedings lasted 3 years and 9 months. Mother Laura fears that her father, Bruce Jordan, who had been a part of the proceedings and now is battling brain cancer, may never get to see justice for her granddaughter because his life expectancy is so short. At the time of this video, it is still uncertain if AJ Gonzalez will be released from prison. Today's case is based in Milton Keynes in the year 2000, which is somehow 25 years ago. Barry White, not that Barry White, worked at a local sports store and he had met Rachel Manning, 19, through friends. One night, his friends had thrown a house party to celebrate their A-level results, and he had struck up a conversation with his future girlfriend. Rachel was very independent and she knew how to handle herself. She was described by many as the life and soul of the party. As things progressed, the two moved in together. However, in doing so, money had been tight. With the money issues that they had, they often found themselves in arguments, and Barry, who disliked conflict, would walk away and leave Rachel to cool down, knowing it should be back to her bubbly self soon enough. So their time living together came to an end. It seemed like the best decision at the time. Rachel then moved to nearby Wolverton to stay with some friends, and Barry moved back to Bletchley to live with his mother. But the two of them didn't split up. On December the 9th, 2000, Rachel and Barry planned to celebrate his mother's 40th birthday with friends at what was to be a 70s-themed party. They were looking forward to a much-needed night out, and they both got fully involved and dressed the part. Barry was in flares, and Rachel was in a distinct pale blue wig. And so they spent the night partying with their mates, drinking and dancing in their 70s-inspired costumes, and some of this was captured by others attending the party. They were evidently enjoying their night, and they didn't want it to end, so they decided to head to Chicago's nightclub in the city centre and continue their celebrations until around 1:30 a.m. At that point, the pair visited a kebab stall, and it was there that Barry got into an altercation with a local man, someone who was actually known to be a troublemaker. The CCTV footage that would later become integral to the investigation shows Barry being surrounded by a few men who can be seen hitting him. Apparently, a drunken Barry had spilled a little salad from his kebab onto the guy's shoes, and he wasn't very pleased about it. The footage then shows Rachel stepping in to help out smooth over the situation, and it seems like she actually managed to do this just before the police arrived to keep an eye on the clubbers. At this point, the pair had walked away from the area, and Rachel was trying hard to convince her boyfriend to go back to the club so that she could get a taxi home. Barry, however, had no interest in going back. He understandably didn't want to bump back into the group who he had just had a run-in with, so he split off from Rachel, heading for his friend Keith Hyatt's nearby house. And Barry made it there in one piece, but not long after, he received a phone call from Rachel. Under the influence, Rachel had struggled to find her way back to the club, and during the phone call, she told Barry that she was lost. And Barry, who had to work early the following morning, was pretty annoyed with her, but he told her to head to a nearby Blockbuster video store, and that he and Keith would be there to pick her up. However, when the two pulled up to the agreed location, Rachel was nowhere to be seen. The two friends then drove around the area looking for the drunk girl in her blue wig. It should have been pretty easy to see her, but they couldn't. They returned several times to the Blockbuster store that she was supposed to be heading to. She should have been there by now, but instead, she'd vanished. Eventually, Barry left Keith in the car to wait for Rachel, whilst he circled the block on foot. This too was captured on CCTV footage, but it was at this point that Barry gave up looking, and he asked Keith to take him back home. After all, Rachel should have made it back to a warm bed, her only worry being an impending hangover. But in reality, the situation she found herself in was of stark contrast to that. The following morning, Barry went to work as usual and later returned home. When he learned that no one had heard from Rachel, he decided to visit her workplace, where he found out that she'd never made it into her shift that morning. At this point, he visited her flatmates and called her parents. They immediately reported Rachel Manning as missing. The very next day, on December the 11th, a white boot covered in crimson red was spotted by a greenkeeper at a golf course in Bedfordshire. As the greenkeeper approached this out-of-place object, he came to the stark realization that what he was looking at was in fact a battered and beaten body, an image that would stay with him forever. Police were immediately called and rushed to the scene. This body was Rachel Manning. A post-mortem investigation revealed the horrors of Rachel's night after getting off the phone to Barry. Her attacker had throttled her, and she had been struck at least 17 times. Teeth were missing, her jaw was broken, her cheeks, forehead and eye sockets were so disfigured that police would later suspect that the perpetrator may have been deliberately trying to make her unidentifiable. None of them could have known that the investigation that they were about to begin would take over a decade to solve, leading down a path so twisted it was almost unbelievable. That morning, Keith Hyatt, the man whose house Barry had stayed at, and the man who was initially helping Barry to look for Rachel, also by chance passed the golf course, and he noted the heavy police presence. He stopped to call Barry's mother, worried it was something to do with Rachel, and then he decided to stop and ask the police officers himself. He mentioned Rachel's disappearance 2 days prior, and he asked if a body had been found. This concerned investigating officers. It isn't rare for a murderer to revisit a crime scene, nor to involve themselves with a case, speaking directly to officers. Keith and Barry immediately found themselves at the heart of a very serious investigation. Both of them were arrested on suspicion. In the 2 months that followed, Keith and Barry were top of the suspect list, as police tried to piece together Rachel's last moments on this earth. After interviewing the two men multiple times, a case was built against them, pinning the act on the boyfriend and painting Keith as an accomplice. Though the police didn't have any real evidence to go by, they believed that the two men were in fact in a homosexual relationship together and had sinisterly decided that Rachel had to go, leaving them to be together. But they would need much more than that to get this case to court. Enter forensic geologist Kenneth Pye. He found lighter flint particles on Rachel's body that were also present in Mr. Hyatt's van, giving the prosecution evidence that Rachel had been in the van some time previously. This counted as physical evidence, so the case was building. 2 years later, in 2002, Barry White would be tried and convicted of his girlfriend's murder, and Keith of perverting the course of justice by helping to dump her body, all of which should have tied this case up in a neat bundle. But this was just the beginning. Barry would serve 6 years of his life sentence pleading his innocence and appealing decisions. And whilst he wouldn't be the first murderer to deny his guilt, more had to be done to determine whether he was actually responsible for this crime. Following the men's arrest, Keith's family reached out to the BBC's Rough Justice team. This was a show known for helping with miscarriages of justice. Before this, Keith had never had so much as a parking ticket, and now he was being dragged into Rachel's murder case. The team at the BBC was immediately interested, given how little evidence the men had actually been convicted on. There were a few suspicious elements that needed to be addressed though. Keith had washed his van the day after the murder, which did paint him in a bad light. So Rough Justice had to proceed cautiously. In the meantime, unsurprisingly, Barry struggled with his incarceration in trying to comprehend the 16-year sentence that lay ahead of him, and he turned to substances early on, and he even spent time in the hospital wing in case he was to make an attempt on himself. However, when Rough Justice got involved, and he began to see that there was perhaps a light at the end of the tunnel after all, Barry was able to live with a new hope. Both of the men submitted themselves for DNA testing, all in the hope to prove their innocence. They were told that if the Rough Justice team got involved and they were guilty, that they would be found out rather than being cleared. The documentary team enlisted a forensic expert, Dr. Peter Bull, who worked pro bono, and he uncovered that the forensics in the case had been circumstantial at best. They did controlled experiments that highlighted how thousands of particles could spread a distance of 2 meters from an individual flick of a lighter. So the evidence of the flint particles that helped to convict the men was actually pretty weak. Between the CCTV of Barry walking around the Blockbuster area looking for Rachel and the phone calls made and received, there was only a 20-minute window in which his whereabouts couldn't be concretely accounted for. The time needed to find Rachel, to murder her, and to travel to the golf course and back didn't actually correlate with any of the timestamps on the CCTV. Most importantly, Barry's DNA wasn't found on the murder weapon found at the scene. In fact, someone else's DNA had been recovered from this steering lock, but it didn't match anyone in the police database. With all of this being brought to light, and so publicly, Keith Hyatt was eventually released on parole in 2005, and then Barry was acquitted in 2007, and then the prosecution was granted a retrial. Barry was subsequently acquitted and released. It's hard to imagine what effect being tried and convicted of a crime you didn't commit could have on a man. But in interviews, Barry has shed light on the hardest part of it all, saying, "It wasn't the incarceration, nor how terrifying it must have been to be thrown in with 400 others serving life sentences. It was how quickly Rachel's family, whom he knew very well, had believed that he was responsible for the crime without a shadow of a doubt." He said the thing that hurt the most was that he faced them over and over again in court, all of them believing him to be a monster, someone capable of such a frenzied and barbaric attack on his own girlfriend. And all the while, let's not forget, Barry was grieving for the woman he loved. Whilst locked up, the night in question must have rolled around and around in his mind. It's amazing he held it together as well as he did. We can imagine he asked himself, what if he had just gone back to the club and gotten Rachel safely in a taxi like she asked? It really doesn't bear thinking about. Rachel's parents didn't help the situation either. Even after Barry had been acquitted, after he had been proven to be innocent, Rachel's parents still condemned him in interviews. For them, the blame remained with Barry because he was the last one to see her alive, believing that despite their bickering on that night, he should have made sure that she made it home safely. Keith Hyatt's only crimes were giving a mate a place to crash, helping him look after his girlfriend in the dead of night, and stopping as a concerned member of the public on that fateful morning when Rachel's body had been discovered. Each had given their version of events multiple times, which CCTV and phone logs had confirmed. Both of the men understandably thought they had a solid defence, yet they still wound up behind bars. If it hadn't been for the involvement of rough justice, along with general media attention, Barry probably would have served his full sentence. The two men would fight for compensation, some justice of their own, but really justice still remained unserved. If Barry didn't do this, that meant there was still a murderer walking the streets of Milton Keynes, or wherever else he may be now. In May 2010, a woman narrowly escaped an attack by the driver of a vehicle that she had initially gotten into, believing it to be a taxi. Fortunately for her, she managed to get out of the car and run to safety, thankfully crossing paths with a Good Samaritan passing by. The Good Samaritan was a lorry driver, and he took the woman home. The lorry driver knew something wasn't right about the car or the driver, so even though the woman didn't want to report the assault to the police, the lorry driver decided to take note of the car's number plate and to report it to authorities. The driver was 41-year-old Shahidul Ahmed. He was a resident of nearby Bletchley, and he worked at a restaurant. When he was brought in, his DNA was taken, and although he wasn't in the system for any previous convictions, his DNA was flagged as a match for that found on the steering lock, the weapon that had been used against Rachel. The police had their man, and they arrested him. Ahmed had approached Rachel masquerading as a taxi driver before then carrying out his attack. In addition to his DNA being found on the weapon, his hair was found on Rachel's clothing. Ahmed was given a life sentence and to serve a minimum of 17 years. Shockingly, it was revealed that he had attempted his taxi ruse on several occasions over the years, and had any of those victims reported it to the police, he may have been arrested for Rachel's murder far sooner, and Barry may have been free to go without his 6 years behind bars. And in fact, none of this may have happened. Coincidentally, the Rough Justice programme was cancelled by the BBC on the very same day Mr. Ahmed was convicted. In late 2024, strange reports began surfacing in Thailand. Women were disappearing, young, healthy, and all with one thing in common. They'd left the country for work, promised lucrative jobs overseas, but once they arrived, they vanished. Their families received brief, cryptic messages, "I'm fine, don't worry," and then nothing. Calls went unanswered. Social media accounts went silent. It was as if these women had never existed. At first, the disappearances seemed random, but investigators started noticing a pattern. Almost every missing woman had last been seen in the same place, Georgia. Authorities began looking into the case, but without concrete leads, there was little they could do. The women were adults. They had willingly travelled abroad. There were no signs of immediate danger, and no evidence of a crime. But then, everything changed. One woman escaped. She arrived at a police station in Georgia begging for help, and when officers asked her where she had come from, she told them something that made their blood run cold. There are more women. They won't let them leave. They take our eggs. Over and over again. The woman's story was almost too terrifying to believe. Something taken directly from a horror movie. She had come to Georgia expecting work as a surrogate mother, an opportunity to help families, while earning enough money to support her own. The woman had seen an advert for a job on Facebook, one that would pay between 400,000 and 600,000 baht, which is around $11,000 to $17,000. The woman from Thailand didn't have a passport, but that was no problem because the passport along with travel expenses were paid for by the company. The woman was expecting to go and live with a grateful and nurturing couple, people that wanted a baby more than anything else in the world. August came around and it was now time for the job to begin. She and around 10 other prospective surrogates were led on their trip to Georgia by another Thai woman, a woman who they expected was their guide and almost their friend. Upon their arrival though, things quickly fell apart. The dream they were sold was now a nightmare. The moment the woman arrived, something felt very, very wrong. The facility wasn't what the woman expected. It wasn't a loving home of waiting parents-to-be. It wasn't even a hospital. The building was secluded, hidden away, difficult to find. The windows were covered, the doors were locked, and a group of around a dozen women would quickly discover they weren't there alone either. 100 other women were already inside. They were mainly Thai, Vietnamese, and Cambodian. All of them had been promised the exact same thing, but now all of them were being held prisoner. This is the real face of human trafficking. Whilst held captive, the conditions were tightly controlled. It reminds me of a controlling or abusive partner's behaviour. Their passports were taken, their phones were monitored. Some of them had tried to contact their families by sending text messages, but every message was checked before it was sent. A single wrong word could mean punishment. The woman told the police that at first they were treated well. They were fed and given beds to sleep in, but soon the procedures began. They were given injections, a series of shots every single day. Some of them started feeling sick, nausea, bloating, pain. When they asked what was happening, they were told it was normal, that this was simply a part of the surrogacy process. But then came the extractions. One by one, the women were taken into a room. They were sedated. When they woke up, they were often writhing in pain, exhausted, as if something had been drained from them. It happened again and again and again. Some of the women had been there for months. Some had lost count of how many times they'd been taken into that room. Endless procedures, an endless cycle of eggs being taken. These women were not free to leave, but there was a way that they could escape. If they were desperate enough, they were given a choice. They could pay a ransom or stay forever. Some women had families back home who could send them money. Others had nothing. No way out. The woman that escaped had to pay a ransom of 70,000 baht or around $2,000. And luckily, she was able to raise the alarm as to what was really happening there. And it was completely crazy. Her story was just the beginning of a huge conspiracy. When authorities raided the facility, they expected to find a small-scale operation. What they uncovered, though, was something much worse. They found 100 women, all held prisoner, all subjected to the same endless cycle of medical procedures. Investigators searched the rooms. They found stacks of medical records. There was names, dates, and evidence of dozens of procedures performed on each woman. The truth was undeniable. This was never about surrogacy. This was about harvesting human eggs, over and over again. The women described what they had been through. Daily hormone injections, stomach cramps, swelling. Some felt constant pain, but they were told to simply endure it, that it was normal, that it would pass. The longer the women stayed, the more dangerous it got for them. Some were developing serious complications from the prolonged cycle of medicines, with some feeling that their bodies were simply shutting down. The woman that escaped was, in this scenario, lucky. Her family were able to send the $2,000 for her to escape. However, for those who didn't have access to that large sum of money, they would be indefinitely locked away in this human egg farm. They had no way out. Investigators found evidence that these eggs had been sold, but no records of where they'd gone, who had bought them, what clinics had processed them, how many families had unknowingly used eggs taken from trafficked women. The deeper authorities dug, the more disturbing the questions became. How long had this been happening? How many women had already been used and discarded? And maybe the most chilling question of all, who was behind this? The raid exposed the horrifying truth that this was not an isolated case of human trafficking. It was part of something much larger. The global demand for human eggs has skyrocketed in recent years. Fertility clinics, private buyers, and underground brokers are all willing to pay top dollar for viable eggs. However, legal egg donation is a slow and expensive process. Many countries have strict regulations. There's background checks, medical screenings, mandatory waiting periods. So for those who don't want to wait, or who are simply willing to look the other way, there is another option: the black market. In countries where oversight is weaker, illegal egg harvesting operations can thrive. Traffickers can lure vulnerable women in with promises of high-paying surrogacy jobs. Once inside the system, they are controlled, manipulated, and then forced into medical procedures that they may barely understand. The women at the Georgian facility weren't just victims of trafficking. They were part of an underground supply chain, a system designed to extract and sell their eggs to the highest bidder. Investigators uncovered evidence that suggests that eggs were being funneled into private fertility clinics, some possibly operating in completely legal spaces, unaware of where the eggs had actually come from, and others, of course, simply may not have cared. Egg trafficking rings like this can't operate in isolation. They require doctors willing to perform the procedures, brokers who can move the product, and clients willing to pay. And with desperate people on all sides of the equation, whether they ask questions or not might depend on how desperate they truly are. And this case is horrifying, but it isn't unique. Similar operations have been uncovered in Cambodia, Russia, and other parts of Eastern Europe. And in each case, the same terrifying realization emerges. For each facility that gets shut down, others are still out there. They're still operating, still harvesting, still using trafficked women as nothing more than a resource. Bank records trace payments moving through multiple countries, transactions linked to fertility brokers, private clinics, and offshore accounts. But where these eggs had actually gone, that was harder to prove. Many of the traffickers fled before they could be caught, and those arrested refused to talk. And the fertility clinic suspected of using these eggs, many simply denied involvement, and others disappeared. For the women who had been rescued, freedom came with its own price. Many will suffer long-term health complications, things like hormonal imbalances and damage to their reproductive systems. Some of them may never be able to conceive again, and psychologically the scars will run even deeper. These women had been promised a better life, and instead they've been treated as products, used, drained and discarded when they were no longer profitable. Some returned home, and others had nowhere to go. No money, no support system, and no justice. And the traffickers who exploited them, it's believed the operation was being run by a Chinese organised crime gang, and the clinics that used these stolen eggs, the families who had unknowingly benefited from these women's suffering, they would probably never even know the truth. And if they did, then they obviously didn't care anyway. This wasn't the first operation of its kind, and it won't be the last. Right now, in countries all over the world, women are still being lured in with the promise of surrogacy, only to find themselves trapped in a cycle of forced egg harvesting. The demand is too high, and the money involved is too large. You can imagine using a mixture of untraceable social media accounts, along with using cryptocurrency as payments. Nobody would ever know any of this happened. For every trafficking ring that gets exposed, there are others still operating in the shadows, new victims being recruited, more eggs being taken, more lives being destroyed. This case pulled back the curtain on a dark hidden industry, but the real question remains, how many more victims are out there, and how many will never be found?
Not a man, he's a monster. How could he do that? Then I realised that his wife and his daughter was sitting behind me. Both blonde hair. The same as Melanie.
Melanie Ann Rode was a happy teenager, one with an incredibly bright future ahead of her. She was born on September the 29th, 1966, to Jean and Anthony Rode in Bath, Somerset, UK. Melanie was the youngest of 3 siblings. She was the baby of the family. However, her older brother Adrian and older sister Karen described her as the intelligent one. Her mother described her as being a child who had her head screwed on, and it seems that she did. Melanie excelled in just about everything that she did. She was the deputy head girl at school, and she seemed well liked by everyone. The 17-year-old was at a pivotal point in her life. She was making plans for the future, and it seemed she had big dreams. While some teenagers are tempted away from academic pursuits when they get their first taste of freedom, Melanie realised the value of her education and wanted to make something of herself. She understood balance. While she studied hard, she made plenty of time for her friends and boyfriend too. She loved music and was said to have never argued with anyone. Her peers described her as bubbly, as did her family and neighbours. With everyone having such warm opinions of her, the shocking details of the brutality she would endure would come as a real blow to those who knew her, as well as the wider community and the country. The straight-A student had been working very hard with her close-knit circle of students. She was just about to sit her A-level exams, with plans to study in the field of archaeology. But Melanie would never sit these exams, nor would she become the archaeologist that she dreamed of becoming. There was only so much preparation you can do when it comes to studies, and so Melanie was persuaded into celebrating the end of the term. It was Friday, June 8th, 1984, and that night she, her boyfriend, along with a few friends, headed out to the Beau Nash nightclub to let their hair down before the A-level exams began the following Monday. Melanie's mother remembered dropping her off at the club. She remembered her bright and bubbly girl had made a smart comment about how the club had rolled the red carpet out especially for her. Unknowingly, this would be the final thing that Mother Jean ever heard her daughter say. The group enjoyed themselves. They drank, danced and laughed the night away. As time drew on, they all left together before separating en route to see themselves home. It was a walk that Melanie had made many times before, and although her boyfriend did ask if she wanted him to call her a taxi, fearless Melanie declined. She had often taken the route alone, and Bath was indeed a safe town. She had no reason to believe that the walk this night would be any different. Melanie almost made it home to her family that Friday. She powered through the half-hour walk and was just 200 meters from her house, but she would make it no further. In the early hours of Saturday, June the 9th, Melanie's promising future was snuffed out. Her final moments were described as lengthy and brutal. It would later be revealed that the fair-haired teenager had bravely fought back despite the ferocity aimed towards her, but to no avail. As dawn came, her lifeless body, described as mannequin-like, was sadly discovered by a little boy helping his father deliver milk. He came upon a trail of red DNA on St. Stephen's Road. This trail led to a cul-de-sac just a 3-minute walk from Melanie's home. The crime scene was a grisly one and must have left a mark on those who discovered it. 999 was quickly called and police put a striped tent over the area to shield the public from the barbaric sight. The body that greeted officers that morning bore 26 separate wounds, all around 4 inches deep. Most of them were to the soft tissue area of her chest. Melanie had been jabbed at through her clothing, but it soon became obvious that the clothing had been removed, but then replaced while her attacker atrociously violated her, gratifying only himself. Her undergarments were found a little further afield later on. The spatter at the scene told them that she had been attacked while standing initially, and then chased around the corner before being brutally laid into. For the officers at the scene, securing the area, shielding the public, and of course identification of the body was a priority. Not far from where she lay lifeless were her house keys. On them was a wooden keyring bearing the name Melanie. With nothing else to go on, police took to slowly driving around the surrounding streets. They simply asked, "Does anyone know Melanie?" with a megaphone. Mother Jean and Father Tony had awoken that morning to discover their daughter's bed was empty. They were both rightly feeling a little worried, but nothing could have prepared them for the bitter reality that they would soon have to face. Hearing the name Melanie muffling through the mechanical sounding amplifier as the police slowly drove around their neighbourhood meant that panic quickly set in. Jean frantically flagged down the vehicle driving by. She told them their daughter Melanie had not arrived home the night before. It was then that her world was shattered forever. She was initially spared the ruthless details of the heinous crime, but she couldn't avoid it forever as it was about to circulate throughout the town. But the harsh truth was, their daughter wasn't coming home. With a monster on the loose capable of such a merciless act, and plenty of evidence at the scene of the crime, the force began a manhunt which they dubbed Operation Rhodium. DNA found at the scene matched just 3% of the population, a rare DNA that helped narrow down suspects considerably. But what would follow were years upon years of dead ends. Between 1984 and 1989, 94 suspects were arrested through Operation Rhodium on suspicion of Melanie's case. Frustratingly though, every single one was ruled out. Sadly, the forensic capabilities of the 1980s were nowhere near today's standards, and so Melanie's case appeared to be destined to become a cold one, like countless others. Mother Jean resigned herself to the fact that Melanie's killer may never be brought to justice for his wicked deeds. She believed the Rhodes family would never get the closure that they so deserved.
We are hoping for success on another case that's remained unsolved for decades. The rape and murder of a teenager, 17-year-old Melanie Rhodes. For a quarter of a century, Melanie's family have had to live with the knowledge that her killer has never been caught. Can you bring them some comfort by naming him tonight?
In 2009, 25 years after the night of Melanie's attack, a Crime Watch special aired with a reenactment of Melanie's final movements that fateful night, her route from the nightclub, and her savage demise. Melanie's case didn't just make it to TV by chance. 2009 was the year that 41-year-old single mother of 3, Detective Sergeant Julia McKay, had been assigned to cold cases. The detective had given 20 years to the force, but she was rarely promoted because of what she described as internal workplace misogyny. She shared how in her previous role, when she was assigned to burglaries, a co-worker had remarked, "What will you do when you catch a burglar? He's ironing?" The attitude she faced from colleagues in the workplace only drove her to be more determined in her approach to work. Once she was assigned to cold cases, which more often than not remained unsolved, and then stumbled upon Melanie's case, she took note of how much paperwork had been gathered and the enormous efforts of Operation Rhodium, and felt in her gut that this may be solvable. With not much more than a hunch, she visited Mother Jean, unaware of the supportive mother-to-mother relationship that would blossom between the two of them. Jean had been on an emotional rollercoaster for 25 years. She divorced from husband Tony, who had since succumbed to Alzheimer's disease. He no longer lived in the home. She didn't have much hope that Melanie's killer would ever be found at this point. She was concerned that Detective Sergeant Julie McKay was just one of many who had tried and failed to find the man responsible. In fact, Jean's hopes had been raised for nothing several times previously. Once when a national database began in 1995 and again in 2000, when a new DNA profile of the killer had emerged from forensic advancements. The monster's profile, however, was now much more detailed, prompting a cold case team to be set up in 2003. Julie made no promises to the woman in front of her. She was honest from the get-go, telling her she was working on nothing but a gut feeling, but she did believe that he could be found. The 25-year anniversary Crime Watch appeal was hit and miss. Televised calls for help tend to bring out a lot of bad leads, with some people just wanting their 5 minutes of fame, and with a case so old, many genuine memories of the night in question were likely to be foggy at best. And annoyingly, none of the 72 new leads generated from the broadcast were of any use at all. However, Julie was unconcerned. She knew that breakthroughs are being made all the time in cold cases, that is, since the birth of the national database. Melanie's killer had left so much evidence at the scene of the crime, his bodily fluids were everywhere. Melanie had fought back. The killer had also been stabbed during the initial struggle, and this DNA had been swabbed. Police had been looking for familial DNA matches since the early 2000s. In 2010, the familial database was funded and updated. There were now 400 possible family members found the second time around, and they were investigated to see if they had anyone in their lives that would match the callous killer's profile. However, it would be another 5 long years before Julie found what she was looking for. It would appear that a year before, in an area of Bath, not far from Melanie's family, a 41-year-old woman had been processed after she broke a necklace during an altercation with a boyfriend. The woman, Claire Hampton, had been cautioned and released, but the DNA that had been taken from her during that arrest had recently been added to the database.
If a relative is arrested, and it has to be a close relative, the clever scientists can say, this person's DNA is so similar to your crime scene, there is a likelihood that it's one of their relatives. And you get a list. So we applied for that and we got our list again. And his daughter was at the top of that list. So we went and swabbed him.
In a stroke of luck for Detective McKay, Claire Hampton was what they refer to as a screamer, a familial DNA match that compares so heavily that it screams direct relative. They issued a warrant to collect DNA samples from her living relatives. The cold case team learned that she had a father, a man who fit the age profile, and who had lived in Melanie's area during the time that the atrocity occurred. Not much else of the profile fit though. To a passerby, her father, Christopher Hampton, seemed very ordinary. He was reportedly a good parent in a loving marriage, and he still worked as a painter-decorator despite his advancing years. However, when police took his swab, which the man gave calmly, willingly, and without emotion, the DNA profile was identical to that recovered on a 17-year-old's body more than 30 years earlier. In finding her match, Julie promptly arrested the then 63-year-old on suspicion of murder on July 3rd, 2015. When the police came for his arrest, his puzzled second wife said, "I'll see you later," to which her cold-hearted husband chillingly replied, "No, you won't." Hampton refused to comment during questioning, and in a pre-prepared statement he had the audacity to deny any involvement. This man had managed to deceive the world for 3 decades. His wife and children would soon learn of his true nature and the horrific things that had happened at his hands. Those who knew the man had nothing bad to say about him, but it turns out they didn't know much about him at all. To have violated and mutilated a young woman, and then to have gone on and played happy families for so long, didn't sit well with criminal psychologists. The man really had fooled all of them, but with the advancements made over the 31-year period, his involvement as a culprit was undeniable. The case went to trial. Hampton eventually pleaded guilty and was near silent throughout. As a matter of fact, he appeared completely emotionless, even during the harrowing details of what he had done, as well as the emotional contents of the family's impact statements.
I always said if I got hold of him, I'd strangle him or stick a knife into him, and that's how I felt, but I wouldn't even use my energy up on him. I feel that he should be shut up in a dungeon like they used to in the olden days and just left to rot, because he's not worth looking after. I know that's against the law, but I can think that. I'm allowed to think that.
It may have taken 31 years, but thanks to huge efforts taken in the 80s to record the crime scene along with modern-day forensics, Melanie's monstrous killer was finally behind bars, where he belonged. Christopher Hampton was sentenced to a minimum term of 22 years.
I don't want to hear it, man. I'm done with everything. Just bring the motherfuckers out here, that's all. We got all the kids are dead in the house.
Okay, how many people?
6 kids, 1 adult.
Donald Charles Spirit was born in 1962 in New Jersey and was often just called Don. Not much is known about his early life, but in 1985, he met Christine Jeffers, who would become the mother of his children. They had their first child, Sarah, in 1988, and were married a year later in 1989. Then they moved to Jacksonville, Florida, and had 2 more children, Josh, born in 1991, and then Kyle, born in 1992. Don was known for having a bad temper. Members of the community referred to him as strange, unable to keep a job, and violent, especially with his wife. Domestic abuse was a regular part of Christine's relationship with Don, and often their children witnessed it. Most of Don's life was spent at odds with the law. In fact, by the time he was 51, he had spent more than 20 years of his life in and out of jail. Sadly, a cycle that his family were born into, and that perpetuated for the rest of their short lives. Dating back to the early 1990s, some of Don's felonies included battery, domestic abuse, traffic violations, felony possession of marijuana and firearms, probation violations, as well as depriving a child of food and shelter, and a hit and run while driving without a license. In 2002, in a fit of rage, Don smashed all the windows of Christine's car with a sledgehammer after threatening to end her life. When questioned by the police after the incident, Christine said she was afraid of her husband. However, she would not make a formal statement against him. Instead, Don agreed to submit himself for a mental health evaluation, and then he was diagnosed with a severe case of bipolar 1 disorder. However, he refused medication or help for the illness. This meant that he was known for having extreme, uncontrollable outbursts and issues with rage and depression. The sledgehammer incident occurred just 1 year after the death of his youngest son, Kyle. Many believed Kyle's death to be the start of what some considered the family spirit curse. Kyle was referred to as a sweet and loving young boy who loved playing outside. He really enjoyed fishing, basketball and soccer, and he dreamed of one day playing for the NFL. His mother used to call him Sweet Pumpkin Pie, and when he was just a toddler, he asked her to call him Applejacks instead, and this became his nickname from then on. In 2001, his father Don planned a week-long hunting trip for himself and Josh. Initially, Kyle was not allowed to join them because Don thought he was just too young. However, Kyle begged, adding that he wanted to do guy things and to be included. He claimed that Josh always got to do the fun stuff while he always had to stay behind. Eventually, his father gave in and brought him along, but only if Kyle promised to stay in the hunting stands and just watch. Don insisted that Kyle was not allowed to handle a gun or to go out hunting with them. On November the 8th, the family arrived at Three Lakes Wildlife Management Area, which is close to Kenansville in Osceola County, Florida. They spent the next few days waking up at 5:30 a.m. to go hunting and were wearing the typical bright orange safety vests that they needed to. Don was carrying a .300 Browning rifle. Josh was carrying a .270 Browning rifle, and as instructed, Kyle was unarmed, walking alongside his brother and father and not partaking. On the Tuesday night, Don cooked up a large meal for him and the boys, and he planned to leave the following morning. So far, the trip had been unsuccessful, so by the time Wednesday morning rolled around, the boys begged for one more try at finding a deer. The family went out on a 2-hour hike and still no luck. It was rainy and gloomy, and at this point, Don was far past ready to go home. As they were packing up the truck, Don was rubbing oil onto the barrel of the rifle. He apparently muttered something like, "There's rust on the barrel," prompting Kyle to lean forward to see what he was saying. And then Don accidentally hit the trigger, and the gun went off. Kyle was hit point blank in the head. This was in front of brother Josh. In shock, Don frantically tried to call 911, but there was no signal. He put Kyle in a truck and then drove back off the campsite to find help. A man named Mike Evans witnessed Don speeding and pulled over to the side of the trail. Once he saw what had taken place, he claimed that it was clear that Kyle was fatally injured. His life had barely started. Mike Evans stated that the incident was the most horrifying thing he had ever seen. En route to the campsite, Don eventually got through to Christine, and she contacted the sheriff's department, as did several of the hunters at the campsite to realize what was going on. Witnesses say that Don was lying over his son's body, screaming, and several of the hunters were afraid that he may end his own time on this earth, too. They tried to usher Don away from his son, but he was inconsolable. Others kept their attention on Josh, the son and brother who had witnessed this gruesome event. They tried to take care of him. One hunter told Josh that he would have to be strong now. Police arrived on the scene, and while many believe that the event truly was an accident, it was discovered that Don had previous felonies, and therefore was not allowed to handle a firearm. As a result, Don was sentenced to 3 years in prison for a felony possession of a firearm. After the incident, Christine opened up to reporters, explaining that the family was not coping and that she was particularly worried about Don. Sadly, the family were unable to pay for Kyle's funeral expenses, leaving them in a difficult financial position. Still, Christine insisted that Kyle be remembered as the sweet boy who bought his brother a bike after saving up his allowance for months on end. He was her Applejack. During the time that Don was in prison, the family moved to a mobile home in Bell, Florida, and their financial struggles only worsened. Bell is a small agricultural community. At the time, its population was just over 200 people, and the small community is known for being close-knit, even though the majority is living below the poverty line, and things weren't easy. Christine was concerned that Don may end his own time on this earth whilst locked up, especially whilst dealing with the grief of Kyle's death and missing several family milestones. Josh turned 13 and their first grandchild was born too. Sarah, the oldest of Don and Christine's children, became pregnant at 17 and was working at a fast food restaurant and a local grocery store. Just a year before Don would be released from prison, Christine filed for divorce after 20 years of marriage. After he was released, however, Don gained sole possession of the mobile home, and his daughter Sarah, now 19, already had 2 children with a third on the way. For the most part, his remaining children and his new grandchildren all lived with him in the mobile home. The father of Sarah's children, Edward, was also known for being in trouble with the law, and he was in and out of the family's lives. This meant that Sarah found herself as a single young mother, with only her father to depend on, especially since her mother, Christine, had become distant since her divorce from Don. By the time Sarah's third child was born, the family had very little food, and Sarah began running into welfare issues, having the Florida Department of Children and Families, or the DCF, called on her multiple times. According to neighbours, one of her children was found alone on the street, and he had bruises and bite marks, and he was holding a sharp kitchen implement. Another, younger than 4 at the time, had an inexplicable broken leg. the family would spend many years chaotically interacting with the DCF, often being reported on by neighbours who claimed that Sarah would leave her children in crack dens, and many of the write-ups reported substance and domestic abuse, medical neglect, and inadequate supervision. However, the DCF continually stated that the children were not in danger. It was not until 2007 that the children were removed from Sarah's custody, which sent her and her brother Josh into a downward spiral of substance misuse and crimes such as larceny. However, this removal was only temporary, and after a series of promises of getting clean and of participating in community welfare programs, the children were placed back in Sarah's custody. By 2008, she gave birth to her fourth child with her new partner, Jamie. At this time, they were living with Don again, and this is when Sarah started reporting Don to the police for physical abuse. On August 27, 2008, Sarah called the police claiming that Don had shoved her up against the fridge and that he had aggressively grabbed her face on either side. When the police arrived, Sarah had red marks across her face, but ultimately she chose not to press charges. This may have been because Sarah's new partner Jamie was also having trouble with the law, and Don was her only support otherwise. By 2011, Sarah's substance addiction had worsened, and the next 3 years marked a steep downward spiral for the family. They were now constantly embroiled in cases with the DCF, along with law enforcement, and by then, Sarah was also being reported by school teachers who stated the children came to school hungry, dirty, and were often injured. One of Sarah's children, Caleb, had cut his foot open by mistake and it became infected after Sarah cleaned the injury with bleach and then wrapped it up in tape. All the while, Don's mental state was worsening too, and his frustrations with his daughter and her children grew. Neighbours stated that he was often seen yelling violently, and that the family were always having fights. It's unclear whether he saw the children as a burden, but he definitely had a strained relationship with his daughter and didn't agree with how she lived her life. Sarah had failed the Better Parent welfare program and now discovered that she was pregnant with her 6th child. As a result of failing the program, the state was less inclined to help her financially, and therefore it was around this time that Sarah, with the guidance of a family friend, Colleen Stewart, turned to escorting, a decision which then raged Don. On September the 18th, 2014, at around 3:30 p.m, one of Don's neighbours claimed to have seen Don angrily pacing up and down the street, looking as though he were looking for or waiting for someone. The neighbour says he remembers it distinctly, as he only ever saw Don riding his bike and never normally walking. While we don't know exactly what happened during this time, we do know that Don made this 911 call at around 4 p.m.
Gilchrist County 911, what's the address of the emergency?
Yes, ma'am. I just shot my daughter and shot all my grandkids, and I'll be sitting on my step, and when you get here, I'm going to shoot myself.
What is the address that you're at, sir?
2550 Northwest, 25 Terrace, Don Spirit. Every one of them are dead.
You said your name is Don Spirit?
Yep.
All right, Don, what kind of gun do you have?
It doesn't matter what kind of gun I got. They're all dead, and then when you get here, I'll shoot myself, and then you figure out what kind of gun it is.
How long ago this happened, Don?
I don't want to hear it, man. I'm done with every thing. Just bring the motherfuckers out here, that's all. You got all the kids are dead in the house.
Okay, how many people? Okay, how many people?
6 kids, 1 adult.
6 kids and 1 adult?
Yeah. One of them is a baby.
All right, Don. Is there any way you can stay on the phone with me till I get somebody there to help you?
What's that?
Can I have you stay on the phone with me?
No, not that. I'm waiting for them to get here. When they get here, I'm going to shoot myself on my back step. All I'm doing is waiting for them.
So you're sitting on your back steps?
Yep.
Okay, Dawn.
Officer Adderhold, who knew Don, arrived at the scene. He found him quickly pacing at the back of the mobile home. Adderhold identified himself to Don and instructed him to put up his hands. Don complied and stated that he was not going to hurt him. He was, however, cursing, and he appeared out of it. Don yelled that Colleen Stewart had turned Sarah into a whore. He went on to state, "I am tired of them all, and I've taken care of it today." Don continued to yell that he killed them all and Sarah's dead too. Eventually, more police show up, and Don became less responsive to their questions. Finally, Don used a .45 caliber handgun to end his own time on this earth. But that was nothing compared to what police would find next. When officers entered the mobile home, they found the remains of all 6 of Sarah's children, and this included her youngest, an 11-week-old baby girl. Sarah too was discovered under a tarp, no longer alive. It appears that she was running away when the trigger was pulled. She was just 28 years old. Kayla Brown was born on November 17th, 1985, in Anderson, South Carolina. Anderson, an affordable small city to live in, has plenty of sunny days and a lot of rural areas to explore. It's located in Spartanburg County, which is on South Carolina's northwest border. By the time she had reached adulthood, Kayla had put down roots in the area that she was born in, and she spent the next few years working various jobs in an effort to support herself. During this time, she met a man named Charles David Carver. Charles was going through a divorce, and he and Kayla instantly hit it off. Like Kayla, Charles had also been born in Anderson, and he was just 2 years older than she was. He worked as a printing machine operator at a local business. It was said that Charles had a winning personality, and he loved joking around and making people smile. Kayla appreciated his light-hearted and easygoing attitude towards life, and within a few months of starting their romance, Kayla and Charles had already moved in together and were fully dedicated to their new relationship. Like many couples in their early years, they appreciated having some extra income to help with their general finances. Existing is pretty expensive. So in 2016, to help with their finances, Kayla decided to take a job cleaning houses for a man named Todd Colep. Colep lived in a near 100-acre rural property in Spartanburg County. Although they weren't close, Todd had been one of Kayla's Facebook friends for years. Colep was a fairly well-known person in Spartanburg County. This was since he was a real estate agent who was doing quite well for himself. So with his successful career in property, it made sense that he might need help cleaning homes, for instance, so they would be ready for listing on the market. During the next 3 months, Kayla cleaned approximately 4 or 5 homes under Todd's employment. To make the jobs go faster, she brought Charles along with her so the two of them could clean the homes together. During this time, Todd was nice and polite to the couple, just as a professional in his field of work would be expected to be. In August of 2016, Todd told Kayla he had another cleaning and maintenance job for the couple, but unlike the other jobs, this one would be his own personal property. When the two of them got there on August the 31st, Colep had to come out and unlock the gate alongside the road that safeguarded his property. As Kayla and Charles got past the gate, Todd then locked it behind them. Kayla just assumed this move was to keep any animals that he might own from roaming off of his rural and rather isolated property. So after entering the property, Colep led the couple to a secluded and roomy 2-story garage. This was situated nearly a mile away from the road. He provided the couple with hedge clippers and bottles of water and said that he needed some underbrush and weeds removed from a nearby trail. When the couple walked outside the garage ready to get to work, Colep said he had to go back inside to grab something and that he would be right back. And when Todd Colep came back outside, he was holding a firearm. As soon as he walked outside the garage, Colep immediately pulled the trigger whilst aimed at Charles 3 times. He was struck in the chest, ending his time on this earth. It took a moment for what had just happened to register with Kayla, An ordinary day had just turned into a horrific nightmare. Everything seemed utterly surreal. Right after calmly shooting Charles, Colep grabbed Kayla. He dragged her inside and cuffed her by the hands and feet. He told her that if she didn't cooperate with him, that she would share the same fate as Charles. She was then moved to a small storage container nearby, and once there, she was chained by the neck. The storage container was extremely hot and completely dark when the door was closed. Colep left her in there alone for a few hours before finally returning. Kayla was told if she tried to run or fight back, that he would end her life as well. And then Colep disgustingly violated her. As days passed, loved ones of Kayla and Charles noticed they weren't returning any text messages or phone calls that were sent to them. Panic started to set in. What could have happened to the beloved couple? The families eventually contacted the police and let them know that Kayla and Charles were believed to be missing. Family and friends were puzzled. They found odd posts that began showing up on the couple's social media accounts. The posts seemed to imply the two of them had gotten married, bought a home, and were doing well. But if they were safe and well, why were neither Kayla nor Charles returning any of the messages sent by their loved ones? The situation seemed to be growing increasingly strange. Authorities did search for the couple, but seemingly they could turn up no concrete leads. In the weeks that followed, authorities had tracked the last cell phone signal that Kayla had to a general area in Spartanburg County, and they discovered from Facebook records that the couple had been taking odd jobs from Todd Colep. They noticed that his land was in the general area where Kayla's last signal came from, so investigators obtained a search warrant for Todd's property. On November 3rd, 2016, police arrived at the property and heard banging emanating from a shipping container, and it was there they found Kayla, still chained around the neck. Police would say she was chained up like a dog. For all of this time, Kayla had been held captive, and she was repeatedly violated by Colep. This ordeal lasted for 2 months before she was finally discovered by authorities. Kayla immediately told police that Charles had passed away after Colep had shot him. Kayla also informed authorities that Colep had once walked her to 3 apparent graves that he had dug for other victims on his property. He told her that if she attempted to escape, there would be another grave for her. Kayla was freed from her metal prison after authorities worked to remove the chains, and Colep was soon arrested for abducting her and for causing Charles's death.
Okay, so you're searching my house and my car. Okay. He's got a copy of the search warrant. He'll show you the copy. He'll show them to you, and he'll leave you a copy. Taz, she's gonna pee.
No. Nervous.
Do you want to help yourself and tell me where the body's at so we can go recover Charlie's body?
No, sir.
You don't want to?
No, sir.
Okay. Why'd you shoot him?
I didn't shoot anybody, sir.
Okay, why'd you lock her in a container in your property?
I was talking about.
She's on your property right now, locked in a container. They just got her out of they called it a specific name. Connex box. She was locked in a container in a Connex box. They got her.
After his arrest, more shocking discoveries were made on his property, bringing national attention to the case. 2 more deceased victims were found and identified as Johnny Joe Coxey, he was 29 when he went missing, and his wife, Megan Lee McCraw Coxey, who was in her mid-20s at the time of her disappearance. As a result of the search warrant, many weapons were found on Colep's property by authorities. These included semi-automatic rifles and pistols fitted with suppressors. It's believed that Colep bought the weapons through illegal means, because he was unable to buy them for himself because of a past offence. Authorities would discover that Colep already had a serious criminal history and a long indication of troubling behaviour trailing back to before Kayla and Charles went missing. In 1987, when he was just 15 years old and living in Arizona, he was arrested and convicted of the kidnapping and violation of a girl. someone who was only 14 years old at the time, when he was sentenced, I guess coincidentally, to 14 years in prison for that crime. The judge had noted that Kohlhepp had displayed dangerous and aggressive behaviour, and he had been doing so since he was a little boy, and that this behaviour didn't seem to be improving. Even at a young age, there were plenty of signs that Kohlhepp might present a danger to others. During his interaction with the juvenile court system, a psychiatric evaluation was completed on him as a result of the crime he committed when he was a teenager. That evaluation noted all kinds of disturbing behaviour that Kohlhepp had displayed throughout his childhood. This included using a BB gun to shoot a dog, killing a fish with Clorox, purposely ruining other children's projects, and even using a hammer to destroy items in his own bedroom. As a result of that crime and the sentence he served, Kohlhepp had to register as a sex offender, and this continued even when he later relocated to South Carolina. But it's unclear how many people he interacted with in South Carolina actually knew about his checkered past. After Kayla was found and Kohlhepp was arrested, authorities told him that they had found Kayla on his property. Now captured by the police, Kohlhepp agreed to confess to ending the lives of other victims, but only if authorities followed his requests. And his requests were that he would be allowed to speak with his mother and break the news to her about his crimes, to give his mother a picture, and to move money to a friend's child's college fund. The authorities complied with these requests, and then Todd Kohlhepp did indeed admit to the kidnappings and killings. But police got much more than they bargained for. Kohlhepp confessed to the still unsolved murders of 4 people: Scott Ponder, Brian Lucas, Chris Sherbert, and Beverly Guy, all of whom were found at a business called Superbike Motorsports on November 6, 2003 in Chesney, South Carolina. Chesney is a very small town located in Spartanburg and Cherokee counties, so the quadruple murder shocked everyone who lived there. Kohlhepp had been a customer of Superbike Motorsports before the 4 workers were deceased, but he had never been a person of interest or even questioned in the case. Until, that is, authorities figured out he was responsible for Charles Carver's death on his property and for his crimes against Kayla. Although authorities had allegedly previously contacted Kohlhepp to ask questions about the Superbike Motorsports murders shortly after they happened, he supposedly simply never returned their calls. It's absolutely crazy to me that this man got away with murder by simply not returning a phone call. Anyway, investigators noted that many former customers of Superbike Motorsports also didn't contact authorities as they were asked to, so Kohlhepp's reluctance to speak to them didn't really raise any concerns. Authorities ran background checks on the customers of the motorbike showroom, but they said that those checks didn't reveal any indications that any of them would commit a crime of this magnitude. It was later learned that Kohlhepp had an issue with the shop after he bought a motorcycle there on April 16, 2003. The bike was stolen soon after he bought it, and he made statements that he believed that Superbike Motorsports was involved, although there was no evidence that this was the case. Kohlhepp said that he also felt that employees of the shop were rude to him, so he decided to bide his time and get his revenge. During his confession, he provided police with details of the crime they hadn't released to the public, further supporting his claim that he was responsible for it. He explained without remorse or feeling how the whole ordeal unfolded. But Kohlhepp wasn't done yet. He also confessed to killing Johnny Coxey and Megan McCraw Coxey, the other deceased people who had been found on his property. The Coxeys were a couple who lived in Spartanburg, and police were notified on December 22, 2015 that they too were missing. Kohlhepp had hired them too to do some odd jobs at his property. And also, like Charles, Johnny Coxey had been killed first, while Megan was kept alive for approximately 1 week longer. By the time the investigation had concluded, Todd Kohlhepp's list of unknown murdered victims had grown to 7, although he has since claimed that there are additional victims that police have just not yet found or linked to him. Kohlhepp faced plenty of charges in court. This included 4 counts of murder for the shootings of the 4 employees, and 3 more counts of murder for the Coxeys and Charles. He was also charged with 2 counts of kidnapping, multiple counts of possession of a weapon that was used during a violent crime, and more. Since he was facing potential capital punishment, Kolep agreed to take a plea bargain to avoid receiving the death penalty. He pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including 7 counts of murder on May 26, 2017. Kolep received a sentence of 7 consecutive life sentences, with no possibility of parole. After Todd Kolep received his sentence, Kayla began working hard to put the trauma she had experienced beside her. In 2018, she was awarded $6.3 million in damages as part of a lawsuit filed against Todd Kolep's estate.
I spend a lot of time in this office and I love saying hi and meeting new people. So if I can help you, or if I can help you figure out how you want to get involved on campus, please come by and let's talk.
Eve Carson was born on November 19, 1985, and grew up in Athens, Georgia. Athens is a vibrant college town. It blends historic charm, thriving arts, and a rich music scene. Maybe the most notable band that comes from there is REM. Everyone that knew Eve said she was warm-hearted and kind. She would always go out of her way to help others, and was known as the friend that was everyone's go-to when they needed someone to listen. Eve also had always excelled academically. At high school, she became class president, throwing herself into planning events and advocating for student issues. She was on the academic team too, and vice president at the National Honor Society. No one knew how Eve could take on so much, with many different people commenting on her generosity with her time. Even with all her commitments, she still volunteered as a peer educator at a safe house for runaway teenagers. When she graduated high school, Eve had left a mark on both the school and her community. Her passion for learning and leadership then took her to the University of North Carolina, otherwise known as UNC, at Chapel Hill. Here she continued to excel academically, while throwing herself into everything that campus life had to offer. Eve was just as magnetic at college as she had been in high school. She'd always greet everyone with a smile. Before long, Eve was involved in student government, community outreach programs, and more volunteer work. She was determined to make a difference where she could. She quickly gained the same reputation, even in this new unfamiliar town, as she had back home, as someone who was deeply driven and compassionate. Her infectious spirit drew people to her, and she became widely known across campus. In her sophomore year, Eve was invited to join a competitive merit-based scholarship, one that emphasized leadership, service, and character. It was a celebration of everything that Eve had achieved so far. As she progressed through college, her focus expanded to issues affecting the UNC campus itself. She began advocating for fairer tuition rates, knowing that financial challenges were a barrier for some students. Understanding the struggles faced by students and working in student government ultimately made Eve decide to run for student body president, and she won in a landslide.
With 3,639 votes, Eve Carson is the student body president of the University of Georgia.
Right after the announcement, Carson told us that all the hard work finally paid off.
I look at it as the product of a lot of hard work and a really committed team. We put so much work into our ideas, into our research, and into just getting out there as much as possible to connect with students.
And so she poured herself into this new role, working long hours to fulfill her campaign promises and address students' concerns. As she always had, Eve also made sure that she committed herself fully to her studies. Even though she'd achieved so much, she never stopped thinking about what may come next. She started considering postgraduate programs, exploring ideas of public health, public policy, or law school so that she could continue making an impact on other people's lives. Eve brainstormed careers where she could blend scientific knowledge with her passion for service, daydreaming of medicine, or joining a humanitarian organization. She was only a year away from graduating and felt so excited at the prospect of her future. And so too did everyone around her, with her family, friends, and professors all feeling proud. Everybody knew that Eve had big things ahead of her, which is why the events on the night of the 4th of March 2008 felt even more shocking, more heartbreaking. Eve's dreams would never be realized. After a night out with friends, Eve was heading to her car in Chapel Hill. Also out that night were two men named Demario James Atwater and Lawrence Alvin Lovett Jr., but they weren't out to have a good time. They weren't celebrating or relaxing. They were hunting for prey. Lovett and Atwater were friends, and on that night, a third friend, a man named Jason McNeil, had declined to join them. Lovett had wanted McNeil to drive he and Atwater around, not exactly an exciting prospect. So with the lack of a friend with a car, Lovett, who was on probation for burglary, instead took his own mother's car and drove with Atwater to Chapel Hill. The two were scoping the local area for a victim, someone that they could take from rather than working to achieve something for themselves. And that is when they saw Eve Carson. She was returning to her car, ready to go home after a night out. As she opened the car door, the two men came up behind her and forced her and themselves into the car. Lovett got into the driver's seat, whilst Atwater sat in the back holding Eve hostage. Eve understandably started shaking and crying. She pleaded with them to let her go. She told them that they could take anything of hers that they wanted, if they could just make sure that she got out of the car safely. Her captors drove her immediately to an ATM. First, they went to one at University Mall in Chapel Hill, where they withdrew $700. They then went to another ATM in Durham, but they couldn't withdraw any more money. Eve tried to reason with them both. She said that they didn't need to do what they were doing. She still couldn't stop crying. This was so far from the world that she knew. She started pleading with them to take her back to campus. After all, they had the money, and this must have been the reason that they were doing this. But Eve's desperate pleas fell on deaf ears. After the second attempt at the ATM, Lovett and Atwater started driving to a wooded neighborhood. This was about a mile from campus. At this moment, Eve started to realize how unlikely it was that they were just going to let her go. The trees at this location were thick and tightly packed together. Eve begged them over and over again to turn around, but Lovett and Atwater had already made their choice. Eve had seen both of their faces, and they didn't trust that she wouldn't immediately report them for the armed robbery. And Lovett was on probation after all. If he got caught now, he'll be going away for a very, very long time. As the car slowed to a halt, there was darkness all around them. The firearm was still at Eve's head. She quietly realized what was about to happen. She knew that she couldn't change their minds, that even with all of her finely honed communication skills, they wouldn't help now, not with these people. So incredibly, Eve stopped asking for them to let her go, but instead she asked if the two would pray with her, seeking some form of solace in what she believed was some of her final moments. Please, she begged. Eve couldn't stop her body shaking. They made her walk deeper and deeper into the woods, tears streaming down her cheeks. Eve was thinking of all the dreams ahead of her that she still wanted to fulfill. She asked the pair one more time not to do this. Instead of answering her though, Lovett and Atwater instead pulled the trigger 5 times whilst aimed directly at her. During the first 4, Eve was still alive, witnessing her own demise in real time. They targeted her right shoulder, her right upper arm, right buttock, and right cheek. Vital fluids in her lungs showed she was still breathing at this point. Eve had spent her whole life trying to protect other people, and she knew that in this moment, the only small chance she had would be to protect herself too. The final shot was fired. Eve raised her right hand in self-defense, but instead of it stopping the bullet, it went straight through to her right temple and then her brain. There was nothing more she could do. In that instant, all of Eve's dreams disappeared. Lovett and Atwater left her body behind. However, they did take her bank card as they ran back to her car. They then drove as fast as they could away from the scene. It wasn't long until a woman who lived close by reported hearing gunshots to the police. They immediately drove to the area that the woman described, and after combing through the woods for a short while, there they found Eve, laying cold on the ground. Authorities contacted the Carson family to let them know what had happened. Eve's parents refused to believe the police at first. How could this be the same daughter who had done so much, yet still had so much ahead of her? They were silent with shock. Likewise, as the news spread, students on campus were devastated. Eve's friends, family, and classmates struggled to comprehend the senselessness of her death. Her absence was instantly, deeply felt. In the meantime, the Chapel Hill Police Department acted quickly. They could feel the weight of the tragedy immediately bearing down onto them. Police knew that they would be under pressure not only to deliver justice, but to help a grieving community make sense of the seemingly nonsensical. People were fearful knowing that the killers were still at large. Could this happen again? Could this happen to them? The first priority was to piece together the events of the night. The reports of the gunshot were made in the early morning, and other neighbours, when interviewed, also mentioned that they'd seen a car, one that seemed like it didn't belong in the area. Officers began a systematic search for evidence, and investigators canvassed nearby areas for potential witnesses, or for any footage that may shed more light onto Eve's final hours. It would be greed that would reveal the first breakthrough in the case. It was the withdrawals from the ATM that Lovett and Atwater made that became the first big lead in the case. They traced the withdrawals made from Eve's cards back to 2 ATM locations, and then they tracked down the CCTV. It showed 2 individuals in the car with Eve, and it showed them using her card to withdraw money. Although the images were grainy, there was enough that they could go on. The images were released to the public, asking anyone who had any information to come forward immediately. And then the next break came from the calls that started pouring in following the footage's release. One tip led them to Atwater, who had previous encounters with the police, and his appearance matched one of the men in the ATM footage. Following the lead, the police dug more into Atwater's background and friends. This took them directly to Lovett, who also fit the second man on the tapes. The police held their breath. They knew now they were getting very close. But every day they also saw the community still grieving for Eve. They knew that they couldn't get this wrong. Carefully, behind closed doors, the police began to build a case. On March 12, 2008, Atwater was charged with first-degree murder. He was 21 years old at the time. The next day, Lovett, 17, was also arrested. There was a sense of relief, a sense that justice may be served. The court appearances were somber, however. The age of the men made everything even more senseless. It seemed their lives were the complete opposite of Eve Carson. Atwater pled guilty, receiving life in prison plus 30 years. He apologized in court to Eve's parents, turning to them and saying, "No matter what the court did today, it would be far from anything I should receive." Eve's parents couldn't speak during the hearing. They were still in disbelief that the young man in front of them was the very same person that had ended their daughter's life. Although Lovett pleaded not guilty, the jury found him otherwise. Lovett was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The community rallied together to honour Eve's memory. Vigils were held on campus before and after the sentencing, and there memories of Eve were shared, of all the times she had helped and inspired other people. A scholarship was started in her name, so that her legacy could continue to support future generations of students. And in the years since, that legacy has only grown. In 2009, an American Idol finalist who was a friend of Eve talked about how her faith in him had pushed him to the audition, even though she was no longer around. This contestant was a man named Anoop Desai, otherwise known as Totem. An annual memorial 5K is also held in her honour. It raises money each year for charity. Her university also dedicated a garden to Eve and to other students who passed away before their graduation. I think from what we know about Eve, that seems very much something she would have wanted, not to take the limelight for herself, but to share it with other lost souls. In that garden, people can sit in quiet peace, listen to birdsong, or look at the monument with the words inscribed on it, learned from every single being, experience, and moment. In many small ways, Eve does live on. Mallory Manning was a vibrant young woman whose life was tragically cut short in a way that stunned an entire community. Her disappearance revealed a dark underworld that few dared to confront. What happened to Mallory, and why? Ngatai Lynette Manning, better known as Mallory Manning, was born in Nelson, New Zealand on February 6, 1981. Mallory's childhood was a tough one, with her father walking out on her family when she was only young. Then a rough stepfather stepped into the lives of Mallory and her siblings, further complicating her upbringing. This background led to behavioural issues. Her older sister Jasmine had similar issues too. Mallory ended up going into foster care because of her poor behaviour, and when she was 14 years old, she dropped out of school. Mallory also formed an illicit substance habit, something which she often used intravenously. By the time she was 15, Mallory had begun selling her body to bring in money. Her life was spiralling quickly. She also began to commit crimes against others to support her habits. Mallory ended up using a syringe full of her own fluids to jab a shop assistant while being involved in a robbery in 1999. This quite terrible act earned Mallory a jail sentence of 18 months. She also did have additional prison sentences through the years for other offences. In July of 2008, Jasmine, who had lost touch with Mallory after going into witness protection, sadly ended her own time on this earth. Jasmine's early demise impacted Mallory heavily. She decided that she didn't want to end up like her sister. In an effort to straighten out her life to avoid the same fate as Jasmine, Mallory decided to quit escorting and try to quit illicit substances with the help of a treatment program. Hoping to live a cleaner lifestyle, Mallory was considering her next steps and thought about studying art. While she was weighing up her options, she was also planning to conceive a child with her significant other. During this time, she moved in with her mother. Despite her intentions to rebuild her life, living clean was difficult for Mallory. She had lost her income when she stopped escorting, so now she was struggling with poverty too. The Christmas holiday season of 2008 was approaching, and Mallory was unable to buy presents for her loved ones, all because the circumstances of her life had led up to this point. Mallory, who was now 27 years old, decided she would return to escorting for one night only to make some money so she could buy presents. She didn't want to be a disappointment. At some point around this time, she also took some substances. These included morphine, methadone, and diazepam. On December the 18th, 2008, Mallory travelled from the Riccarton suburb of Christchurch to Central Christchurch. Central Christchurch was known for its red light district, a place where escorts tried to find clients. Mallory's regular spot when she was working the streets was an intersection of Peterborough and Manchester streets, and so that is where she headed that night, and she met with a client at 9:30 p.m. The client returned Mallory to her street corner after their appointment was over. Another client arrived, and after that appointment, Mallory returned to her corner at about 10:20 p.m. Another worker saw her at around 10:35 p.m, but she noticed that she was gone around 10 minutes later, and that was the last time that anyone saw Mallory. Her body was sadly found at 6:50 a.m. the next day. It was located in the Avon River, when a runner saw what appeared to be legs in the river and flagged down a nearby kayaker to paddle over and take a closer look. Several weapons had been used in the crimes against Mallory. She had been throttled, repeatedly jabbed, violated, and beaten viciously with a metal pole. Police were able to identify Mallory based on her fingerprints. This was because of her prior run-ins with the law. They were able to quickly figure out that she had been working the street on the night of her murder, with many people reporting seeing her standing there in an eye-catching outfit, a bikini top with blue and white polka dots, a pink skirt, and a cardigan. Police learned the last text message she replied to was at 10:43 p.m, when she quickly responded to a message a client had sent her. There was nothing unusual about her reply, nothing that would suggest she was in any sort of danger or that she was scared. But when the client messaged Mallory again, less than a minute later, her phone was no longer in service. Her watch had stopped working at 10:59 p.m. the night before. This was because of contact with the water, so police were able to pinpoint her time of death to a narrow window of time. In approximately just 16 minutes, Mallory had been attacked, violated, her time on this earth ended, and her body dumped in the river. The investigators interviewed hundreds of people, and they received a list of Mallory's clients, which was approximately 40 people long. Police were able to clear both of the clients that she had seen shortly before her demise. Witnesses reported a dark vehicle that was potentially linked to the crime because it was spotted near the place that she had been found, and at around the same time that the crime was believed to have happened. Police knew the murder wasn't a result of a robbery because Mallory's purse was still over her shoulder when she was found. There were a lot of possible people of interest in this case, including men who frequently picked up the local escorts. Despite many leads and an intense investigation by police, the trail of the killer grew cold. New Zealand police offered a $50,000 reward that would be given to anyone who provided information that resulted in an arrest. The December 31st, 2009 deadline for that reward passed without an arrest being made. Police would occasionally announce new developments, keeping the crime fresh in people's minds. One announcement said that they had found grass seed on Mallory's cardigan and sent the seeds to Dallas Mildenhall, one of the world's top pollen scientists. Mildenhall noticed through his microscope that some of the seeds had a rare second pore, and so police asked him to examine grass samples from a place they had suspected as a possible murder location. In a stunning break in the case that was announced in December of 2010, the analysis of those seeds helped police pinpoint the location of the murder. Mallory had been killed at a property on Galbraith Avenue. This was located in Avonside and was a known gang hangout. The hangout was used by the Mongrel Mob, the largest street gang in New Zealand. Although New Zealand is known overall as a safe country to live in, gangs are still a problem there. The Mongrel Mob was known to demand money from street workers as a kind of tax for working on any streets that they considered as theirs. Another escort told police that Mongrel Mob members were telling the women working the street that night to share their earnings with them, with the understanding that there would be consequences if they didn't. The gang members were forcing the working women to pay $20 each for each client they saw. Police began to look closely at the members of the gang because of the link to the crime scene. They suspected that more than one person was involved, partly because of the short time frame of the crime, and the moving of Mallory's body would have been hard to carry out with just one person. The case seemed to go cold though, and time continued to pass. On March 29, 2012, more than 3 years after Mallory's death, police finally made an arrest in the case. They charged Maua Fawcett, a 20-year-old Mongrel Mob prospect known on the streets as Muck Dog, with Mallory's murder. At the time of the murder, Fawcett was 21 years old. He resided in Christchurch and had ties to the property in Galbraith Avenue, the location where the murder had occurred. He wasn't officially a member of the gang at the time of Mallory's murder, but he had the gang's symbol, a bulldog, tattooed on his cheek in anticipation of becoming a full-fledged member. Police had zeroed in on him early in their investigation as a potential suspect because he made a confession stating that he was involved with the attack during intensive police interviews. Fawcett met with police 11 times for interviews during a 3-year stretch. In one of the interviews, Fawcett told police that Mallory had been brought to the Galbraith Avenue property with the intention of carrying out a planned hit because she hadn't paid the debt that she allegedly owed the gang. Police believed that she was ended for this debt, although they weren't sure whether it was a $20 per fee client the gang was charging, or if it was an unpaid illicit substance debt. Fawcett, who was being initiated into the gang, said that he was supposed to carry out the attack, but according to his story, he wouldn't do it. During another interview, he said someone had given him a metal pole and instructed him to hit Mallory with it. Fawcett told authorities that he closed his eyes and struck her as he'd been told.
No, I'm haunting Tom. I can feel it. I feel it every day. I try and hide it away too. It's just worse. It's worse and worse every time I think about it. Yeah.
In subsequent interviews, his story frequently changed, and at another point, he said he wasn't there at all when Mallory was attacked.
From my head just going...
Just let it out. You've told me one story. Right?
Yeah.
That you now tell me isn't true.
The confession that Fawcett made wasn't a slam dunk in the case against him, however. Some of his statements didn't match up to the facts of the case. For instance, he mentioned that Mallory was stripped of her clothing during the attack, but when she was found, she was still wearing the majority of her clothes. It didn't seem too likely that her assailants put her clothing back on after the attack, especially within the very limited time frame. Other things he said to the police didn't match up with some of the witness accounts either, nor with Mallory's cell phone records. In total, Fawcett was questioned by police for 30 hours, spread out over 11 sessions over the span of 3 years. Even though his confession was considered coerced and inaccurate by some, authorities felt they had enough to proceed with the trial. On February 7, 2014, Fawcett's trial started, with him in charge of his own defense, assisted by a lawyer. Fawcett said that his confession had been coerced by the police, and he admitted that he might have been high when he made the statements. The prosecution presented no tangible evidence linking Fawcett to the crime other than this confession. There were no forensics linking him to Mallory, no eyewitnesses placing him at the scene, and no weapons in his possession or tied to him. In March of 2014, however, it was apparent that the juries didn't believe Fawcett's court statements, that he lied when he said he was involved in the heinous crime because they found him guilty. He received a sentence of life in prison, but had the potential to be granted parole after serving only 20 years. Despite the sentence, police didn't stop investigating because they believed that additional gang members also had a role in Mallory's attack and demise. The mystery about who was responsible for this violent crime deepened. In August of 2017, a retrial was ordered in Fawcett's case by the Court of Appeal, with one of the reasons being that the court learned from expert testimony that Fawcett had a diagnosis of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, a fact that wasn't brought up during his trial. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorder can happen when mothers drink alcohol during pregnancy, and it leaves people with lifelong disabilities. The disorder severely affected Fawcett's brain and memory, and it was discovered that when he wasn't able to remember something, he often just made up information to fill in the blanks. Even through the investigation and the interview process with Fawcett, police had noted how slow he was intellectually and how he seemed to have a difficult time in understanding things. The Court of Appeal acknowledged the fact that the jury may not have been convinced of Fawcett's guilt, even with the confession, if they knew about his impairments that greatly damaged his ability to give a true account or understand that he was being coerced. A High Court justice determined that Fawcett's incriminating statements were not going to be allowed in his new trial based on their unreliability. As a result, the court dismissed the case against him in 2021, and he was released from prison. To this day, Mallory's murder remains unsolved, with no other arrests made.
As the police know themselves, and you yourselves know, well, I was in Luton, take the kids to the pictures. I was a bit of a womaniser, but that's all.
It wasn't me, and I had nothing to do with it. I have not paid anybody. I have not done it.
This case spans an unbelievable 40 years. It exposes the very darkest of human nature. What follows is one of the most twisting cases I have ever covered. This is Dark Case Documentaries. Carol Morgan was born on the 26th of December 1944. She had 2 children, Dean and Jane, with her husband Richard Curtis. The family lived together in Swindon, England, UK. Carol was a devoted mother besotted with her children, and she was also a loving wife. Still though, despite her best efforts, her marriage to Richard was rocky and they subsequently divorced. Carol remained with her children in the family home, and Richard's involvement in their lives eventually dwindled. As a result, Carol began seeking support at an organisation for single parents called Gingerbread. The organisation seeks to help single parents with financial, emotional, and practical needs through their helpline and community outreach. It was through Gingerbread that Carol met a man named Alan Morgan, a man 5 years younger than her. Alan's affiliation with the organisation is kind of unclear. However, not long after meeting, the two started dating. And by 1977, 5 years after her divorce from Richard, the new couple were married. They appeared happy and Alan moved into Carol's family home with her and the children. She was excited for her life to start all over again. In December of 1979, Carol and Alan bought a small corner shop that was situated at 51 Finch Crescent in Linslade, Bedfordshire, and so the family relocated, moving into the flat above the shop. They called the shop Morgan's Store. The business was bought using Carol's share from the sale of the house and partly from a business loan procured in life insurance surety between both Alan and Carol. Carol was immediately very well liked in the village, and she'd been described as friendly, thoughtful and warm. Many of her neighbours considered her an especially good mother. Unfortunately though, not everything was going well. The business was struggling, presumably due to its location and the type of goods being sold, and just a year later, the family was described as living hand to mouth. This dream of a new life had quickly turned into a nightmare. The Morgans' accountant at the time stated that he was concerned that sufficient income was not being generated for the family. In addition, Jane, Carol's daughter, recalled several checks bouncing when payments to suppliers had to be made. In the UK, we have a saying for situations like this: you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. To make matters worse, it was around this time that Alan began having an affair with a woman named Margaret Spooner. Many believe that Margaret was only one of Alan's many lovers, and even he has described himself as a womanizer. Carol learned of the affair when Margaret's husband, Michael, confronted Alan at the shop, threatening him and insisting he end the affair. Carol was shattered and heartbroken, but nonetheless, she seemed determined to make her marriage work. In some small way, it seems she blamed herself. By August 1981, several months after learning of the affair, Carol confided in her uncle. She said that things were getting better in her marriage and stated that her and Alan were now being intimate again. This was significant to her as prior to August, their relationship had grown distant, cold, and lacking in physical contact. In addition, on the 11th of August 1981, Carol visited the Citizens Advice Bureau for support with the couple's marital problems. She had even scheduled a session with a marital guidance counsellor for the 18th of August 1981. However, Carol would never get the chance to try to make her marriage good again. On the 13th of August 1981, just 2 days after visiting the Citizens Advice Bureau, at around 5 p.m, Alan took both of his stepchildren, Dean and Jane, to the Odeon Cinema in Luton, about half an hour from where they lived. He stated that they deserved a treat for helping in the shop, and that going to see a movie would be a small but fun reward for their hard work. However, this meant that Carol was alone in the corner shop for the evening. Upon returning home from the cinema at around 10:30 that night, Alan sent the children upstairs immediately and then he entered the shop. It was there he found Carol, brutally hacked to death, in the storeroom. Alan then called the police. They arrived promptly and entered the crime scene. Police indeed found Carol in the storeroom and deduced that she had been working there when she was attacked. She had been bludgeoned with a sharp object, an item they thought was either a sickle or a machete. However, no weapon was found. Superintendent Brian Prickett stated that the murder was the worst attack he'd seen on a human being. 2 fingerprints were found atop one of the freezers. Yet, most of the crime scene was relatively bare. Not much evidence to be found. Finally, they discovered that around £500, along with multiple boxes of cigarettes, were missing, suggesting that the motive of the attack was robbery. The murder prompted a massive investigation, all under the leadership of Superintendent Brian Prickett. The village was left in complete shock. Subsequently, 1,204 suspects were interviewed, fingerprints were checked, and over 600 witness statements were taken, all in an attempt to piece together the incident and track down the killer. On the fateful night at around 7 p.m, multiple witnesses claimed to have seen a man walking down the street from the corner shop. They stated that he was carrying 2 plastic bags, and they saw him getting into a dark green estate car. As a result, nearly 30,000 vehicles were checked. The suspect was identified by witnesses as being between 17 and 20 years old. Tracking the man down would not be an easy task. The building's layout allowed for 2 entrances into the corner shop, one from the street and one from the flat. Whilst there were several eyewitnesses of the man leaving the shop, no one saw him entering. Police therefore suspected that the man may have had access to the flat, entering from above. Still, despite the mass investigation, the police were unable to secure any evidence that was not circumstantial. There had been several attacks and murders of a similar nature, all on female shopkeepers in recent months, and police feared that they may have a serial attacker or a possible serial killer on their hands. In April 1981, Susan Sheen was attacked in the shop that she owned, sustaining several cuts to the head by a sharp, heavy object. Thankfully, she recovered, but did not identify her attacker. The following year, in January 1982, another incident took place. Dora Pratt, who was 76 at the time, was attacked in her flat above her shop in Ipswich. She was found unconscious by a police constable, having sustained blows to her head, and around £200 was missing from the shop. She regained consciousness in hospital, describing the attacker as a young man, aged about 20, with silver-rimmed glasses. Unfortunately, Dora did pass as a result of the injuries sustained in the attack, and her investigation eventually went cold. Carol's investigation, however, was still underway, although it wasn't promising. Still, Superintendent Prickett became convinced that they were missing something crucial, and so he turned his attention to Carol's husband, Alan. Prickett claims that he had initially suspected Alan, but the husband's alibi was airtight. He was at the cinema with his stepkids, and of course there was that tie-in with the other shopkeeper attacks. However, Alan began giving interviews to the press, and it was there that he was coming across as arrogant, and he was actually seeming to enjoy the attention.
There's quite a few other people who won't shop here because they're afraid of being caught up in the gossip.
What are they saying about you?
It's been found that I killed my wife. And as the police know themselves, and you yourselves know, well, I was in Luton, take the kids to the pictures.
What grounds do they think they've got for saying that?
Well, because I was happy-go-lucky, I suppose. I was a bit of a womaniser, but that's all. That's the only reason.
How did the death of your wife affect you?
Affect me? Well, I closed the business for 7 weeks while the police were investigating it. I lost a lot of stock throughout, and I've had to sell the business now at a loss. The kids are all right, but I think myself and the kids think that it'd be better to get away because it's their future. They've got to live with a shadow over them all the time.
Are the police any nearer, in fact, catching the person that did kill your wife?
Well, they're saying they are because they're eliminating people all the time. So they must be nearer to catching the person.
If ever they do catch the killer, will you come back here?
I don't know. It all depends. I'd like to get hold of the killer though. That's what I'd come back for.
He also showed no indications of remorse or grief for what had happened to Carol. In fact, one of the reporters who interviewed him later admitted to feeling suspicious about him, attributing his doubts to Alan's unusual responses and steely demeanour. He also moved in with his mistress, Margaret Spooner, soon after Carol's death. Superintendent then recalled that on the night of Carol's death, Alan seemed unusually calm and displayed no signs of upset despite the death of his wife. He also noted that it was suspicious that Alan had sent his children upstairs immediately once they arrived home without saying goodnight to their mother, suggesting that he may have known what he was about to uncover and did not want them to find their mother's body. Many of the community members also noted that it was strange for Alan to have taken the children to the cinema in the first place. They stated that he never spent time with them alone, and certainly was not known to treat them. Prickett began to believe that this was Alan's way of ensuring his cast Alan alibi, and not just a fun night out. In addition, officers discovered that Alan had withdrawn a large sum of money the night before the attack, and made a large order of cigarettes a few nights before the incident. They also knew that it was likely that the killer had access to the flat, and that, in lieu of witnesses seeing him outside, he must have entered the shop from upstairs. Finally, law enforcement also became aware of the fact that a few months before her murder, Carol had changed her will, leaving everything to Alan. By this stage, Superintendent Prickett believed Alan was involved in his wife's murder. He suspected that Alan had paid the attacker and conspired to kill his wife for her life insurance and his inheritance so that he could start a new life with his mistress. However, all of this evidence was again deemed circumstantial. All that Prickett had was a hunch, so Alan was never charged. Instead, the case went cold. 40 years passed and it was now 2018. Cold case investigator Detective Superintendent Carl Foster, along with his team, began reviewing cases. And Carol Morgan's case stood out. They started by re-interviewing every living witness who was interviewed in 1981. The process of reviving Carol's case was painstaking, but Superintendent Foster had a hunch they could crack the case. 3 years later, in 2021, Jane Bunting would make a startling revelation. Detective Superintendent Foster stated that when he knocked on Jane's door, she opened it and then said, "I've been waiting for you to come visit me for 40 years. Jane revealed that when she was 17, Alan approached her in a pub and discussed the various ways that he might kill his wife. She claimed that he said he hates Carol and doesn't want to be married to her. She says he also stated that he wished she were dead, and wouldn't an accident be nice? Furthermore, Alan asked Jane whether her boyfriend at the time, who had previously been in jail, may be willing to help. Jane stated that she was shocked and appalled, and she left the pub immediately.
It wasn't a, I had nothing to do with it.
And you had a new woman that you moved in with, yeah?
Margaret Kent.
Oh, and I say you, someone that you'd already been having sex with. But now you could carry on a relationship with her without any complication to Tom.
Who?
You said the police weren't looking as you have been involved in this at all.
No, well, quite nothing to that. I don't know.
But you, after Carol's funeral, you just carried on, never went back to the cemetery, is that right?
No, don't I ever do. So how did you know I didn't, that the murder wasn't in the holiday? So I sent the kids upstairs. Well, I didn't know the murder was not upstairs. There's that joke by the kids downstairs, those disappeared. So I sent them upstairs. Because Pepper got in the bed. I don't know. Is it because you knew nobody was there? No. You knew this was going to happen. No, and you knew they'd already gone. But the plan was they would lock up behind them, you'd give them a key. What's that? Was this the monkey? No, you tell it. I'm telling you now. No, I have not paid anybody. I have not done it.
Finally, in 2024, Alan Morgan was tried in Luton Crown Court for the murder of his wife, Carol Morgan. With Jane Bunting's testimony, prosecutors felt their case was strong, and along with other testimonies and witness statements, they brought forward the evidence that was previously deemed merely circumstantial. In court, the original lead detective on the case, Superintendent Prickett, stated he was very grateful that Jane had come forward and propelled the case, because he had been unable to shake the investigation from his mind, calling it a thorn in his side. He states that he always knew Alan was guilty, but he simply couldn't prove it. He also stated that, unfortunately, he doesn't feel he could have done anything differently, and that Jane's statement was simply the missing piece. Pamela Smith, Carol's cousin, gave a victim impact statement during the trial, describing the horror that befell Carol's parents, who were absolutely crushed by the event. Margaret Spooner, Alan's mistress, was also charged because prosecutors suggested that she knew about the plot. Tapes played during the trial revealed Alan shushing Margaret in a police van for fear of being recorded. He also wrote her a letter on the year of the murder, indicating that he desperately needed her trust. Carol's children were left motherless and spent the majority of their young lives raised by their stepfather and his mistress. Alan kept the children away from their grandparents, who had already suffered the loss of their only child. All of this time, Alan lived most of his adult life free, and he was financially secure due to Carol's life insurance and the money he received from Carol's recently altered will. Detective Superintendent Carl Foster suggested that Carol was effectively erased from all memory, including those of her own 2 children who have grown up without their mother, being raised by the man responsible for her death. After an exhaustive 2-month trial, the jury broke away and deliberated. Margaret Spooner was cleared of all charges. However, Alan Morgan was found guilty for conspiring in the murder of his wife, Carol Morgan. The judge sentenced him to 22 years in prison. Alan Morgan is 74, and he will presumably spend the rest of his life locked up. He, however, maintains his innocence. On one side, justice has been served, but now it seems far too late. Not to mention the fact that the killer, if alive, is still out there. Alan Morgan is the only person who knows his identity, and I wouldn't hold your breath. One cold morning, on December the 30th, 2016, a hunter was out walking his dog in the Congo forest in Galou, Belgium. It was during this walk that the man's companion alerted him to some charred remains which he initially presumed to be that of an animal. However, the thought must have played on his mind, because the following day he decided to call the authorities first thing and report what he had stumbled across and where it could be found. The local police arrived and were greeted by a stomach-churning sight. Psst. Join the Dark Case family in a circle over on Patreon. When you join, you will gain access to exclusive documentaries, a credit and thank you in every single Dark Case video, priority case suggestions, exclusive updates and a peek behind the scenes, and most exciting of all, you will gain access to the private Dark Case Discord server, which is kind of like a chat room for inner circle members only. Membership is just $5 per month. Cancel anytime. Welcome or welcome back to Dark Case Documentaries. If you didn't know, I post true crime, disturbing stories, and other things that you may later regret knowing. Around 50% of you watching right now aren't yet subscribed, so make sure that isn't you, and if it is, you know what to do. If your name is on screen right now, then you're a legend. Let's get straight into today's Dark Case. Wild rats were dining upon a rotten carcass, with the front of the skull burnt beyond recognition. The frail burnt body was so badly charred, it had almost zero defining features, but 2 things were clear. Number 1, this was in fact a human, and not an animal as the hunter had first thought. And number 2, it had been there for quite some time, because decomposition had already set in. The body was transferred to the closest mortuary, and an autopsy began on January the 2nd. The body was that of a female. She had suffered numerous blows to the face, and in fact, the nose, cheekbone and eye socket were all fractured. The hands and feet, however, were still intact. This helped them determine that they were dealing with the remains of a slender young woman. Her toenails still bore a distinct glittery nail polish, which, with so little to go on, the police were hoping may identify the Galou Jane Doe. They even took photos around to local nail salons in the hope that someone would recognise their work and be able to give them a lead. But with no missing persons reported at the time, and the gruesome state of the remains, identification would prove far more difficult. The Belgian police had very little to go on, and the victim's sparkly toenails would prove to be a complete dead end. Examination of the body by medical examiners revealed that the slim woman had a pronounced overbite, and judging by the shape of her skull, she was likely of Asian descent. This prompted investigators to reach out to every Asian embassy and to question immigration office employees, as well as staff at local refugee centres. But none of this brought around any new leads. This could only mean one of 2 things. Either the woman hadn't been reported as missing yet, or she was somehow estranged from her family and friends, so there was nobody to even notice that she was gone. During examination, a fragment of clothing had been recovered from her body. This just so happened to be part of a t-shirt label bearing the Asian brand Masakino. The clothing label operated exclusively within Asia. She also wore a striking Japanese manufactured watch, one of only 1,300 ever made. Their first thoughts were that they may have found a woman named Narumi Kurosaki, a Japanese student who had gone missing from France in early December. They thought the killer could have perhaps transported her body from France to Belgium, all in an attempt to get away with the murder, but Narumi was very quickly ruled out. So authorities were back pretty much to square one. The details that they had told them they were dealing with a travelling tourist, a foreign student, or someone who had recently emigrated instead of a Belgian resident of Asian heritage. As far as building a profile for her assailant, all police could really determine was that they probably would have been local to have known the secluded area where the body had been discovered. Police kept their focus on identifying the victim, hoping it would lead them to the killer. Door-to-door searches and interviews also proved to be of no use. Police also visited the numerous large-scale mushroom farms nearby that were known to largely employ Asian immigrants. They also visited Asian-themed restaurants and questioned local escorts. This is because it does happen that Asian immigrants in Belgium can make their way into that industry. But while the initial efforts to identify the woman were commendable, the woman known as a Galu Jane Doe would have to wait 2 long years before she finally had a name again. Every year in the United States, at least 400 unidentified persons are found no longer alive. But even with no formal ID at the scene of a crime, police can run fingerprints, check dental records, and consult the DNA database. But things were truly stacked against the Belgian authorities because their body had no identification and was unrecognizable facially, and at the time, the country did not have a DNA database of its own. To try and remedy this, they reached out to bordering countries, but to no avail. This Jane Doe seems to have appeared from nowhere and then met a terrible end. While the police were busy canvassing and exhausting every lead, the forensics team was sifting through the charred portion of the remains. Beneath the body were burnt newspapers soaked with white spirit. Some fragments of these papers survived the fire, and they were legible enough for police to recognize it as Metro, a Dutch publication. One recovered fragment marked the publication date as November 21st, 2016. This gave the officers a possible date for the murder. The larvae and maggots that made their way into the mortuary with the body corroborated the story, putting her probable time of demise on the 20th or 21st of December. It wasn't much, but it fueled the search for answers, and throughout the year, police identified 2 new leads. Firstly, a local man who saw the facial reconstruction put together by sketch artists remembered seeing a local man out jogging with his Asian girlfriend in the area at around the right time. He then relayed red flag after red flag to the authorities, telling them that the man had a preference for Asian women, seeking them out on dating websites. He also lived in a house surrounded by security cameras, which seemed kind of odd. He had arrived in Belgium with a Thai girlfriend who had a daughter. He recalled how no one had seen them since the pair had split. The man was also said to enjoy burning wood as a hobby, and he had recently left the country, headed for Thailand. Police ransacked the man's home and informed the authorities in Thailand. Nothing was found there to tie the man to the case. But perhaps he was just very good at covering his tracks. Belgian authorities then finally heard back from Thai police. It was revealed that the man, his girlfriend, and her daughter were all alive and well and happily on holiday. It had been sheer coincidence and bad timing that had aroused suspicions. Another man from Menon was also briefly looked at as a potential suspect. He had a Nepalese girlfriend who hadn't been seen in a while, but they too were ruled out. The police continued in vain, renewing their request for the public for their help, But with so little to go on, like many Jane Doe cases, police hit a dead end, and the case may have remained this way had it not been for the victim's worried father. The Vietnamese man had reported his daughter as missing in his home country, but it appears the investigation conducted by Vietnamese police wasn't treated with much interest. His daughter, Nguyen Thi Duan, had always been the most studious and academically gifted of all his children, and so the modest man had invested heavily into her. Her studies had forced the family to take out several loans over the years, and somehow they managed to send her abroad to Japan to study accountancy and management. However, the financial expenses of living in Japan meant her father had to send her money regularly. To pay it back, Nguyen worked at various jobs. She was a housekeeper, a waitress, and also worked at a checkout at a local supermarket. Somehow, even with such a tight schedule, Nguyen met a Belgian man named John Rosier, a man that was simply visiting Japan, and the two of them hit it off. Once the elderly father made mention of a Belgian boyfriend, one that he didn't approve on, the case concerned Vietnamese police even less. They saw the father as probably just being overprotective and simply not approving of his daughter's partner, something that is not exactly uncommon. No one knew that Nguyen, somewhat naive in love, had in fact been in extreme danger. Another reason why Vietnamese authorities weren't that interested with the investigation was because Nguyen had left for Belgium on her own free will. Nguyen's father was left to continue his search for his daughter alone. He turned to social media and posted to Vietnamese community groups in Japan and Belgium, but to no avail. Finally, with the Belgian mystery man so heavy on his mind, the man reached out to the Vietnamese embassy in Brussels himself. The embassy got wind of the Galoo Jane Doe, and they passed the information on to the Vietnamese police, requesting DNA samples from Nguyen's family, and the DNA was in fact a perfect match for the body recovered from the woods. The Belgian police finally had a name after 2 years of dead ends. Along with the DNA that arrived in a sealed diplomatic suitcase was a mobile phone that Nguyen had sent back to Vietnam. The messages on this device gave police a devastating lead. The text revealed the relationship between Nguyen and John. It showed the pair of them had initially begun discussing their hobbies and interests, but it wasn't long before things became of an intimate nature, and it was apparent that the pair had consensual relations whilst in Japan. In the most recent messages, John appeared to be pressuring Nguyen to travel to Belgium. This was so they could continue where they'd left off. John had sent 139 messages, trying to convince a reluctant woman to come to Belgium. He would often turn the conversation to kids and starting a family together, something that Nguyen seemed to want too. John had even messaged Nguyen's family, asking them to let her come to Belgium, stating he had already paid for the tickets. Her family, however, wanted her to find a boyfriend closer to home. Under pressure though, it seems Nguyen eventually decided to take him up on the idea, and she did fly out to meet him. However, John hadn't bought the tickets as he had been saying. Instead, Nguyen had actually taken out several loans to fund her trip to Belgium, travelling via Helsinki in Finland and Amsterdam in the Netherlands before boarding a train to Belgium. She had no accommodation booked, and John never even came to meet her on her arrival. The best piece of evidence recovered from the phone was the man's passport and identity card, but there was a slight issue. John Rosier's identity card featured 2 S's, so the name didn't totally match. The inconsistency wasn't the only problem. The passport numbers on the card were fake. It was then learned that a friend of Nguyen had been giving contact details including a Belgian phone number. However, the number was listed to a company in Menin with over 400 employees, and not a single one of them with a surname, Rosier or Rossier. But Rosier's forged passport picture did match the employee ID of 29-year-old John Vanderlei. he was instantly recognised as the same man on Nguyen's phone. The police, pretty certain they had their man, made an arrest on November the 8th, 2018. They set up a ruse to get their man under the guise of a DUI checkpoint. When the suspect stepped out of his vehicle, he was directed to a police van where he was told the breathalyzing equipment was kept. It was there he was cuffed and arrested. The man showed no real emotion, and he also didn't seem surprised at all. Vanderlei had been living a double life. His work took him to many parts of the world, including Japan, and when travelling, he left behind his long-term girlfriend. The two met in 2009 and moved in together in 2013, and their relationship was seen as serious to everyone apart from John. When John travelled to Japan in May of 2016, and he spoke to Nguyen via a dating site, his girlfriend back at home was in fact pregnant, and John was about to become a father. John had lied about his name in their exchanges, so that Nguyen wouldn't be able to look him up on social media. He didn't want his soon-to-be wife and mother of his child to find out about this affair. John's long-term girlfriend described him as a modest man, and so infidelity never really crossed her mind, let alone potential murder. There was, though, an account of the man once slapping her across the cheek, but she said it stopped the moment she called him out on it, and she promised to leave him if there was a next time. John tried to deny all involvement, initially admitting to nothing other than simply knowing Nguyen. However, during his next interrogation, he gave a confession. He now admitted to being responsible for the death of Nguyen, a woman who he had met whilst working in Japan, and he informed police they would find her cell phone and her tablet buried underneath the man's family bathtub, which had recently been installed. The 9,000 plus messages gave police the evidence they needed, and although the man's story would chop and change, one thing seemed to be abundantly clear: they finally had their man. He told officers that he had lured Nguyen to the country for intimate acts, and that he wanted to show her his country and for her to have a better life. Strangely, he then changed his story and tried to paint it as an accident that he believed his fiancée was partially to blame for. John said that his long-term girlfriend didn't give him regular enough pleasure, and that had prompted him to cheat. He said if this wasn't the case, Nguyen would still be alive. John's trial took place on January the 8th, 2021, 5 long years after he had taken the life of his extramarital partner. In court, he took back his statements, now telling them that he put no blame on his partner, a partner who had still been regularly visiting him, until that is, he had dealt her the blow of trying to pass her the blame for his actions. This case was the judge's first murder trial. The possibility of an insanity defense was immediately thrown out, as psychological evaluations were presented. John wasn't mentally unwell. Everything he did it on purpose. We will only ever know John's version of events, but here is what we can deduce actually went down. Nguyen arrived tired from her travelling, and she had expected to be met by John, who did show up, but turned up late. She was rightfully disappointed that he had made her wait, and in a country she was setting foot in for the first time, knowing nobody but him. Once in the car, she picked up John's phone and the two had an argument. John told her she mustn't take any photos of them, and it was now that he explained his family situation. In another version of events, John revealed that Nguyen had seen his social media, and there she had made the discovery that he had been so desperate to avoid, that he was in fact a family man with a long-term partner and a child. Regardless, it was then that he maintains they had a heated argument, which led to Nguyen slapping him, and he says he retaliated. He admitted in court to striking her at least 3 times, after which she was said to have passed out. John then pulled over and smothered Nguyen with his bare hands before driving back to his home, hoping his girlfriend wouldn't be there. He said the entire altercation only took moments, and that, incredibly, Nguyen had only been in Belgium for 22 minutes. With Nguyen lifeless laying parked in his vehicle outside, he entered the home, greeting his partner. Fortunately for John, the blinds were closed and his partner saw nothing. It was then that John gathered a few supplies and went back out to his car. He then drove to the Congo forest and placed Nguyen's body into a plastic barrel that he had retrieved, along with newspapers and white spirit. He then lit it all with matches. John said he left the scene immediately, without waiting more than a moment for the fire to take hold. John discarded Nguyen's handbags and backpack into a nearby canal, and these personal items were never recovered. He also threw her ID in a nearby dumpster and disposed of her wallet the next morning. What this court case really boiled down to was whether or not this had all been premeditated. John insisted that things had escalated quickly, but that it had all been an accident, describing himself as a sweet boy. However, the serious turn of events and gruesome findings from 5 years previous could not just be ignored. It was highlighted that in their text messages, John had told Nguyen not to buy a return ticket. It was also obvious that John had taken advantage of his physical strength, using it to overpower Nguyen, even fracturing her skull. Prosecutors argued he was cold-blooded because after he struck her, he pulled over further down the road to suffocate her, an escalation that could have been prevented, that is, if murder wasn't already on his mind. They also revealed that John had taped Nguyen's mouth shut before setting her on fire, and also shared with the court that his text messages revealed that Nguyen wasn't the only person that John had had liaisons with on his travels. However, it was ruled that the murder had been too sudden, and the haphazardness of it all suggested that it was indeed unplanned, especially given that the man had driven to his own home with the body still in the car in order to gather a barrel white spirits and the matches. Whilst undeniably guilty, premeditation was ultimately rejected by the jury. John Vanderlei was sentenced to 27 years in prison. The prosecution was originally hoping for 28. Nguyen's family, however, expected something entirely different. They were shocked to learn that the death penalty didn't exist in other parts of the world, and they had assumed that John would die for his crimes. Still, the killer was behind bars 5 years after Nguyen's remains were found, in one of the most horrifying scenes police had ever witnessed. When asked how she felt about John's infidelities, John's ex-girlfriend would later share that she held no resentment for Nguyen. This was because the poor woman was an innocent party, just one more partner who had been lied to and misled. Nguyen had got herself into debt to visit Belgium, to take in the sights, and to possibly start a new life with what could well have been her dream man. But instead, she got 22 minutes of mayhem, and her hopes and dreams went up in flames. Make sure you're subscribed and hit like if you appreciate what I'm doing here. I'd love to see your thoughts and read your discussions about this case down in the comments. Be careful out there, and I'll see you soon.